Out here today. Our last RAC, I mentioned that we heard from the community that you guys want a new facilitator to help with these meetings. Process of procuring that new facilitator. So the good news is we have actually got that facilitator for us for the rest of the RAC meetings through February. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it over for introductions.
Cool, thanks, Kelly. So, hi everybody. My name is Brian Keekley. I'm a facilitator. I work for a company called the Langdon Group. I live in Boise, Idaho. So, really excited to be here. Just a little background for me. I've been at this for 20 years or so. I've worked in Harney County in the past. I facilitated Wildfire Collaborative for a number of years. And I'm also doing some other groundwater related work in Nevada and in Idaho. So kind of come at this from a few different directions, but really my role here is to facilitate the conversation, ensure everybody has a seat at the table, and really for the department, allow them to keep their hat on as that and play that role that they're intended to, and they don't have to move back and forth between managing the meeting, managing the conversation, and presenting the information to you. So happy to be here again. So let's go ahead and get this started. We'll start out with, I guess, just a few housekeepings. Everybody heard it is being recorded, so know that's happening. We have people joining online and folks here in person. Facilities, restroom, the drinking fountain is in the back there. You're all probably pretty familiar with that. We have a break scheduled, so there'll be time to do that when we come to it. And yeah, I think that what we want to be able to start with here is introductions. So first, let the department do their introductions. Kelly, if you want to start, maybe we can move around this way.
Sure. Kelly Mines, I'm the rural writer, rural coordinator for this process. The guy that you get a lot of emails from, said hopefully send and receive documents.
I'm Tim Seymour. I'm the assistant manager for the groundwater section. I'm based out of Pendleton, Oregon.
I'm Alexandria Scott. I'm the public engagement coordinator focused on the East region, and you will see me in various meetings here around Harney County. Namely, this week it'll be this meeting and the Harney Collaboratives meeting on Thursday.
I'm Dark Boschman, hydrogeologist in the groundwater section out of the Salem office. I'm Cade Tiller, assistant water master here in Burns.
I'm Grant Thomas. I'm a hydrologist for the area in the surface water section. I'm not a fan.
Jerry Rodden, hydrogeologist, groundwater section.
And then we do have one OWRD 2 online. So Laura, can you start? Okay, Ivan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm sorry about that. I'm trying to get Brad in. So Laura Hart, I'm the other rules coordinator with the department, just trying to help Kelly out today. Thanks.
And Ivan Gall calling in from here in Salem, acting deputy director for water management for the department.
Okay, so that's the department. I want to hear from all of you just a little bit. I know we don't need to go into some in-depth introductions, but it'd be good for me to get a feel for who everybody is here. So, and I guess before we do that, ensuring that we have the RAC members up here in the horseshoe and members of the public not, in the back or on the side here. So if we need to make any adjustments, we can do that now. But assuming that the folks around the tables here are the RAC members, I think we could just maybe start here and go work our way around. But it'd just be beneficial for me, probably beneficial maybe for a reminder for a lot of folks. Share your name, if you're representing a particular interest, but also just really get an understanding of how you use groundwater.
Matt Bixby, irrigator, and making sure we don't get screwed over.
I'm Jim Shepard, also a producer and groundwater user, just off Sage-Hen Valley right here.
I'm Leslie Richmond, irrigator, not a RAC person. Brianna O'Connor, SWCD.
And Leslie, I'm just general public. You want me to go up there?
Well, I mean, ideally, yeah, so we'll talk a little bit about how the meeting's gonna go, but we are gonna kind of have RAC discussion and an opportunity for public comment when we talk to the agenda, so. That would be ideal, like granted, we have a lot of empty seats, it's not the answer we need, but.
Angie Catcher, I'm on the Harney County Watershed Council and an irrigator.
Karen Lynn, I'm the coordinator for the Watershed Council.
Kristen Singh, I'm the irrigator.
Irrigator Diamond.
Kevin McCann, I'm just a domestic well, older property owner. Louis Mold, irrigator.
Mark Owens, irrigator, politician, domestic well owner, community member.
Kristen Shellman, Harney County Commissioner, local property owner, water user myself.
Excellent. Thank you.
And we have a few members online here.
Oh, yeah, that's right. And actually, I have your names here. So I've got a few names here. We'll run through the names that I have that we've identified as RAC members online. Once we get through that, if we miss anyone, just feel free to let us know. But we'll start with Jeff. Jeff, if you want to go ahead and unmute and introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi everyone, Jeff Mackey, RAC member, recently retired from the Mount Her National Wildlife Refuge.
And Zach.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm Zach Freed. I'm also a RAC member. I'm with the Nature Conservancy. I'm a hydrologist and I don't use groundwater so much as I appreciate its characteristics as a groundwater or as climate resilient habitat for ecosystems.
And let's see, Brenda.
Hi, everyone. Brenda Smith, RAC member. And sorry, I'm not in person today. Thanks.
No problem. Lisa.
Yeah, Lisa Brown, I'm a RAC member. I work for Water Watch. And I've been involved in the groundwater issues out there since 2014, and including as a member of the collaborative.
And John.
County Commissioner, just interested in what's going on as most of this issue is in Harney County and just a small southern portion of Grant County. So just listening in.
Then we got another John.
Okay,
John
and
Short.
the next John.
Hey, John, you're muted, I think.
Hey, is that better?
There you go.
There we go.
Okay, I'm learning. John Short, water right guy, taking care of lots of groundwater users, in the Harney Basin. So.
Then we got Brandon.
And Brandon.
Hey, good afternoon.
Yep, sorry. I was gonna say he might need to know what the prompting question is because he just joined. I'm sorry about that.
No problem. Yeah, Brandon, just share your name if you're, what's your interest or who you're representing and how you use groundwater.
Sure. So I'm Brandon Haslick, the fish program manager for the Burns Paiute tribe. And I'm here to kind of to serve the tribe as a technical point of contact during this process. And the tribe has interests in protecting the groundwater supply that they use for domestic purposes mainly, but we also have connections, a smaller connection with some inholdings and agricultural in a limited capacity.
Excellent, thank you, Brandon.
No, I think Sue just joined.
And Sue, if you just joined us, just asking the RAC members to introduce themselves, let us know who you're representing or your interest in this, as well as how you use groundwater.
Hi, I'm Sue Maupin. I'm the native seed specialist for EcoSource Native Seed and Restoration, and we're working to get native seed production into Harney County, reducing water usage.
Okay, and did we miss anybody that's online? Members of the RAC, not necessarily members of the public. Okay. All right, so moving on, just kind of to talk about the goals of today's meeting. We have a couple of major agenda items. We'll go over the agenda here in a minute, but when it comes to the draft sub area map, we're going to spend a lot of time on that this morning. So what we really want to be able to do is build mutual understanding and capture your feedback on the map and really on how the map was developed and the tools that were utilized in order to create those sub areas. You know, if we want to try to keep it at that level, you know, to dive into very specifics about each sub area could be a little cumbersome and, you know, take a lot of time. But if you do have specific issues with sub areas or questions or comments, we still want to capture those. So I'm just going to kind of gauge where the conversation goes, and we can capture in our notes, you know, if we need to do some specific follow-up with any individuals. But really getting a big picture or concept of the information that fed the development of these sub areas is understood, and if there's any questions or concerns. Then we're also going to get into the criteria for curtailment again. So not looking specifically at the map, but looking at the criteria, the draft criteria that the department's come up with, and getting your input and feedback on if that makes sense, if there's questions or concerns, and any feedback you have on that. And then reviewing the classification rule language and discussing alternative approaches. So again, you know, sharing what the draft and where it's at right now, and getting your input and feedback. So really, these are some key pieces of this whole process. So this is an important meeting, and getting your input is going to be help this move forward in a collaborative way. So here's the agenda. When I get done here, I'm going to go over some ground rules, but we'll get into that sub area discussion. We'll take a break. We'll do the criteria for curtailment, and then the rule language discussion, and then we have a half hour set aside at the end for public comment. So kind of the ground rules, so to speak, today. So we ask, you know, I guess overarchingly to be respectful. You know, we want everyone to be respectful, share input. You know, the value of this kind of conversation is hearing other perspectives and hearing where people are coming from. But as long as we do that in a respectful manner to the department, to each other, to everybody involved, that's going to help the conversation move forward. Again, for the public comment section, we have a half hour set aside. We, you know, preferably we keep the conversation in these agendas to the RAC members, and then the public has their opportunity to provide comment at the end, and that's for the public and not for the RAC. But you know, if there's clarifying questions from the members of the public that would help the conversation, we can entertain that. So, you know, raise your hand, and this kind of goes for everybody, RAC members and public. If you have a question or a comment, raise your hand, and I'll do my best to identify who indicated they have a question or comment and get those addressed in order. So that's the easiest way. If you're online, you know, use the raise hand feature. You could put something in the chat, and between Tim and Kelly, they can help me kind of flag when those are coming in online, and we'll make sure we grab those as well. Let's see, anything I'm missing here? We'll go into a little bit more specifics about the public comment period when we get to that point of the agenda. Yeah, I think that covers it as far as ground rules. Okay, RAC operating guidelines. So I think probably everybody's familiar with this, and I just touched on this, but we just want to make sure it's all understood. Expectations of the RAC: attend and participate in meetings at the Horseshoe or online. Horseshoe, well, not really a horseshoe, we closed it off, but you get the idea. The table's up here. Provide input and advice and help the department consider various perspectives. The public's role: listen during the presentation of the RAC discussion, both in person and online, and then provide input and advice during the designated comment time. The department's role: facilitating the meeting. That's my role here, not necessarily the department's role, but as a third-party neutral facilitator, I'm here to manage the process and ensure everyone's participating at the right level and being respectful. Foster collaboration. You know, this is, as we know, you know, ultimately rules will be developed by the department, but this is still a collaborative process where the success of this is gonna have a lot to do with the input and feedback that you can provide. You're the experts on the ground, you know what the situation is out there. So that's gonna help feed a rule that's hopefully reflective of your needs and interests and meets everyone's interests. Consider the RAC and the public feedback. That's a key piece of this, and ultimately the department's role is to draft the final rules.
Okay, just quickly, next couple of slides, we're just going to kind of give you a reminder of the timeline that we are on for the Division 512 rulemaking. We are currently going through, as you know, the rules advisory process, the RAC rules advisory committee process. We have added an additional RAC. Originally, we were only planning for 5. We are doing a 6th RAC, February 20th. I'll be sending out calendar invites this week for the times. Thank you all who participated in the survey. I'll be sending out those surveys Thursday or Friday. I'll be sending out calendar invites to you guys. After that, we're going to be doing a public comment period. We're planning for a 90-day public comment period with multiple public hearings here in the county. And then we're aiming for a September adoption of the rules. It's kind of more of just a summary of what's going on. So again, from August to February, we're doing our RACs. And then April to June, we're doing our public comment period of next year. July through August, we'll be taking all the written comments and oral comments received, drafting the staff report, changing the rules as needed. And then in September, bringing it to our Water Resources Commission for adoption. We are currently on schedule for meeting that September adoption. But again, as I've said, last couple of meetings, this can change. We could need more time, need more discussion time, and then we could take that more discussion time as well. But that's what we have planned so far. So without further ado, actually, I don't want to step on the facilitator's toes.
No, I think we're ready to go forward. I just want to check in and make sure any questions about the schedule or anything else that I shared here in the introduction. Okay, and so
can I make one? Somebody did want some clarification as to when non-RAC members could raise their hand to ask questions. So could you please just go over that one more time?
Yes, so we have a public comment period time designated. So that's the last half hour of the meeting today. 4:30, is that right?
Correct. Yeah,
okay.
4:30.
So the preference would be to hold those comments till that time. However, if there's questions that are clarifying questions about the information being presented because it's not understood, then I think we can entertain that. I want to be flexible. I want to be able to make sure everyone's participating, but I don't want to be a hard line on that. But if you have a question and because there's just misunderstanding or confusion about what's being presented, if you're online, the chat would be the best place to do that. That way we can look at it, process it, and answer it. If you're here in person, raise your hand and we'll see what we can do to incorporate that. If we're behind on the agenda and we need to get trucking, we may just need to keep moving forward, and I'll just have to make that call when we get there. But I'm also have a parking lot. If there's questions that come up that we need to follow up on, we'll capture those and ensure that we come back and follow up with you.
Thank you.
And then just before I forget also, I'll grab some of my business cards and put them on that table just so they're there. So, in my job as a facilitator, I also want to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to, get their input and their questions out. And if they're not feeling like that's happening, or if they're not comfortable doing it in this setting, I want to be able to help you with that. So, after this meeting, I'm always available to check in, and it's really beneficial for me to have some one-on-one conversations with the RAC members to get a feel for where your concerns are, so I can hopefully incorporate those into the process. So I'll do that here in a minute. You'll grab one if you'd like to. And with that, I think we can move on to our first agenda item.
Thanks, Brian, Kelly. Again, everybody, I'm Darek Boschman, hydrogeologist in the groundwater section. I understand that perhaps some of you hadn't had as much time with the sub areas map as we might have liked and you might have liked, but hopefully by now, all of you have at least had a chance to take a look at it. Today, this presentation the goal of it is to introduce the draft proposed sub areas map. We're going to step through just a few examples to kind of describe the process, again, of how we develop these boundaries. So our goal today is to get feedback from the RAC on these draft proposed sub areas and to answer any questions the RAC or the public might have about the process we used to delineate the sub area boundaries. So first, what is a sub area? And I'm just going to read this. We've kind of put a lot of thought into how we think about and describe a sub area. So a critical groundwater sub area is a portion of a groundwater reservoir that shares similar hydrogeologic properties and similar groundwater conditions, including groundwater level elevations, seasonal and annual water level trends, and responses to natural and human stresses. The intent of dividing a critical groundwater area into sub-areas is to group wells together that similarly impact the local portion of the groundwater reservoir and where reductions in groundwater pumpage through voluntary or regulatory action will have a timely, measurable, efficient, and similar groundwater response within that sub-area. So that's a mouthful. There's a lot there. But each component of that is a really important consideration when we're thinking about what these sub areas are intended to do. So I guess before I move on, any questions about that, about what a sub area is, how we think about them, and we'll talk a little bit more about the role of a sub area in the process in the coming slides. Seeing none. How can sub areas be used? So these sub areas, we're envisioning them as being useful in a number of ways. First, for voluntary agreements, sub areas can clarify which groundwater users in the basin can work together on a voluntary agreement. Sub areas will be used for curtailment. They can facilitate targeted curtailment within a critical groundwater area with the goal of reducing groundwater level declines within those areas where the water level declines are most severe. So this approach of using the sub areas attempts to minimize the impacts to groundwater rights that aren't located in these areas where the declines are most severe. The department is also considering moving forward using the sub areas for future transfers. So when a transfer application comes in, we have to make an assessment for same source. And so these sub areas might be useful for helping to make that determination. And again, this relates to this idea of timely and efficient and similar impacts to the groundwater reservoir within those sub areas. And finally, the department is considering using the sub areas to facilitate targeting the water use measurement and reporting requirements to specific areas. And this may delay the cost and burden of measurement and reporting and other portions of the critical area. Any questions from the RAC on that part of how we're envisioning using the sub areas? Okay. So before we get to the map and the examples, I just want to step back to our last RAC meeting and remind everybody of the criteria that we're using to delineate the sub areas. And again, they are the hydraulic gradient, which is the driving force of groundwater flow, groundwater level trends, which provide information on seasonal and long-term responses to stresses, and subsurface materials. These are our geologic deposits throughout the basin. So we discussed each of these in details at the last meeting, and we stepped through one example of how we use these criteria to delineate a sub area. We'll step through a few more examples of that today. So we've taken those criteria and we've applied them across the entire critical groundwater area to delineate 15 contiguous sub areas. So those 15 are listed here on the right and shown at the map on the left. I want to be clear that the department does not anticipate requiring curtailment in each of these 15 sub areas. So how that curtailment process is timed and implemented is open to discussion. There's a lot more conversation that'll be had with the RAC about how that moves forward. So there's 15 proposed sub areas. To go through the details of all 15 of those would take multiple meetings, 4-hour meetings. We just don't have time for that. So the goal today for this presentation is to walk through just a handful of examples that I'm hopeful will help to further demonstrate the process we use to delineate the sub area boundaries, how we applied the criteria for a sub area delineation. So as I step through the examples, I'm hoping members of the RAC, if it's not understood how a particular criteria was used, feel free to ask questions. And at the end of the presentation, I think we've blocked out ample time to have further discussion on these examples and on the other sub areas in that map that you have in front of you. So let's step into our first example, and we touched on this in quite a bit of detail at our last RAC meeting, but I just want to kind of expand on what we talked about last meeting. So the Dog Mountain sub area and the Weaver Springs sub area, as we discussed last time, as we touched on, this is an area where the criteria indicate that 2 separate sub areas are appropriate. So the Dog Mountain sub area, shown here in green, covers the land surrounding Dog Mountain, Sunset Valley Lane, and the western part of Wrights Point. The Weaver Springs sub area, shown here in red, covers lands enclosing the main Weaver Springs groundwater level cone of depression. Just a few kind of statistics about these 2 sub areas. Groundwater levels in the Dog Mountain sub area have declined over 35 feet in some areas, with a median annual decline rate of about 1.5 feet per year. While groundwater levels in the Weaver Springs sub area have declined over 100 feet in some areas, and within that sub area, there's a median annual decline rate of over 5 feet per year. So we can see just from the water level decline data that there's a clear difference between what's happening across these 2 sub areas. The map here shown on the left shows the distribution of total decline values across this area. So for an individual well, the color represents the total decline reported for the available water level data at that well. The red symbols represent wells with over 75 feet of total decline, and the orange symbols represent wells with over 50 feet of decline. So again, you can see that the area with the most severe water level declines is down in that main Weaver Springs kind of depression. And this again helps you kind of understand why we want to consider treating these 2 areas differently. Yes, Brad.
Dork, when you put that information there, one of my concerns is, are we talking about 2 years, 5 years of data to come to that conclusion? There is longer term data, and it becomes problematic sometimes to really analyze it, compare, and come to conclusions. It's sort of like the confidence level in statistics, the level of data over time, randomness, those sorts of things. So that's probably been my biggest concern in all of this. I always said we need at least 12 years of data. We don't have that. Some areas we have lots of 3-year-old data. Just a general concern in people drawing conclusions. What would your reaction be to that?
It's absolutely true, Fred, and especially for this total decline value, the period of record is critical for understanding what these values mean. And taken alone in a vacuum, just looking at these values, it's hard to, just from that alone, to draw conclusions, because you may have wells that only have 5 years of data going back 5 years. And those declines in that area may have been occurring for 20 years prior. So the data set, when you look at the total decline values, is a mixed bag. And we discussed this some, I think, last meeting. It's not just, we're not just looking at the total decline values, we also have the decline rate values. And so that's a value that represents how much from one year to the next, what is that rate of decline? And so taken together, the total decline values and the decline rate values can help really paint the picture of what's happening in an area. But it's absolutely true. You have to kind of understand the subtext of, what assumptions were made when the database was queried. What is that period of record is really the critical question when talking about total decline data. So you have to kind of take everything together. And that's just the nature of time series water level data. So in addition to the difference in decline rates and magnitudes in these two sub areas, we can also look at the groundwater level contours. So this is our hydraulic gradient, as well as the subsurface materials to help us delineate these boundaries. And again, we talked about this for the Weaver Springs sub area at our last meeting. So shown here on the map at the left are the groundwater level contours representing the deeper part of the groundwater flow system. And we can use these contours like we did at our last meeting to get a sense of the general direction of groundwater flow. So these blue arrows on the map here represent the direction of groundwater flow across this area. For the Dog Mountain sub area, the southwestern margin is defined by a hydraulic gradient where the groundwater flow direction transitions from southerly flow to a more easterly flow. So this is the divergent groundwater flow gradient that we discussed at our last meeting. The northern boundary here is defined by a transition from easterly and southeasterly flow to the north, to the southerly flow down towards Sunset Valley to the south. So this is a divergent groundwater flow gradient across that northern boundary. In addition to that, the eastern boundary here is defined by the 4,090 foot water table elevation contour. Now, again, the contours shown on the map here are contours representing the deeper part of the system. What's not shown here is the water table elevation contours. This red line represents the elevation of the water table at that location. And this short southeastern boundary shown here is defined by a transition from this narrowly constrained northern arm of the cone of depression, this little finger of decline that's reaching up to the northeast there. That southeastern boundary is defined by that transition from that northerly constrained northern arm of the cone of depression down into the broader main Weaver Springs cone of depression. And across that southern boundary, we also have a transition from primarily basin fill sediment deposits down into primarily cinders and what we call proximal vent deposits.
Can you point when that in this distance, if you've got a point or somebody could, I lost you there, but I got the general gist of it. Yeah, so something like that when if it's too hard, don't worry about it.
Yeah, it's a little tricky going back and forth. I'm hoping these lines that I pop up here can do most of that, but if not, I'm happy to clarify.
The lines when I get focused on are fine.
Yeah, so that southeastern boundary across here is where I'm talking about. We have this kind of narrowly constrained part of this broader cone, and it really transitions across this area from this narrowly constrained kind of finger of these contours into this broader, more widespread cone of depression. And we use that transition to constrain the location of that part of the sub-area boundary. Okay, so that was the Dog Mountain sub-area and the criteria we used to delineate those boundaries. Now moving down to the Weaver Springs sub-area. Again, here at Weaver Springs, in addition to that difference in decline rates and magnitudes, we look at the groundwater level contours, that hydraulic gradient, to help guide our decision-making process for delineating the sub-area boundaries. So like we did for Dog Mountain, I'll step through some of the specifics here. This southern boundary is defined generally by the 4,090 foot groundwater level elevation contour. And across that southern boundary, it's further constrained by, again, this transition of subsurface deposits from primarily cinders and our proximal vent deposits up in the Weaver Springs sub-area. Whereas down to the south, we move into our basin filling sediment deposits. this eastern boundary. Here, similarly, the water table elevation contours aren't shown, but this red line there on the east represents the 4090 water table elevation contour. And in addition, on that eastern boundary, we have again this transition from primarily proximal vent deposits, these cinder deposits, and moving to the east, you move into the basin filling sediment deposits. Our western boundary on this side is defined by the 4,100-foot groundwater level elevation contour. And the northwestern boundary is defined by a divergent hydraulic gradient where groundwater flow is transitioning to southeasterly flow into that main cone of depression. So really with Weaver Springs, what we're trying to do is capture that area that is encompassing this very well-defined cone of depression in this area where the declines are most severe. Questions on that process? Okay.
I have one.
Yes, please.
So how do you get this Harney Lake clear up past Weaver Spring?
I'm not sure I follow, Ben.
That sub area, the Harney Lake goes clear past Weaver Spring.
Are you talking about to the?
Yep.
So up in here, yeah, so I don't have a set of slides to describe that, but you can kind of make it out here, and we did discuss it last time. This contour up here represents, this is that basalt plateau kind of between Palomino Butte and Wrights Point. And up in that area, there's a bit of a groundwater mound, and groundwater is flowing basically radially out in all directions from that high point. And so this is not the right map, or we don't have the data in this presentation to describe it, but basically groundwater is flowing down to the southwest from that area, more towards Warm Springs Valley, and what we're calling our Harney Lake sub area, rather than directly towards Weaver Springs. Again, it's going to be difficult to get into the finer details of all 15 of the sub areas, really without putting together slides like this showing the data for each one, but happy to follow up in the future on any of those types of specific questions you might have. Okay, now we're going to move over to the Crane sub area. The Crane sub area covers lands in the vicinity of Crane and sections up to the northwest of Crane. Again, groundwater level decline statistics here. Water levels in the Crane area have declined as much as 70 feet in some areas, with a median annual decline rate of approximately 1 foot per year. The map here again shows the distribution of total decline values across this area. Yellow symbols here are wells that have seen more than 25 feet of total decline, and orange symbols are wells that have seen more than 50 feet of total decline. So the rate of decline, 1 foot a year, is kind of the median value for the rate of decline, is not as great in this area as it is, say, over in the Weaver Springs area. But it seems as though these declines began earlier than they did elsewhere in the basin. And notably, the Crane area is the first part of the basin where the department began hearing about problems with water levels declining. So again, the rates aren't as rapid as elsewhere, but this decline has been ongoing for quite some time. Again, here the map is showing the groundwater level contours representing the deeper part of the groundwater flow system. And overall, as you can see from this map, the sub-area is defined by the extent of this cone of depression expressed in these deep groundwater level contours. The northern, western, and southern boundaries are defined by the 4,080-foot contour. And the eastern boundary here is defined by the 4,090-foot contour. Again, the goal with this sub-area and the boundary delineation is to capture that area encompassing this area of decline, this cone of depression. There's no questions. We'll move on to the Upper Silver Creek sub-area. Mark, please.
Can you go back to it?
I can.
Sometime in the future, could you give us the wells and what the extrapolation for those boundary lines were done?
The data used to create the contours. Yeah, that's all gonna be in the groundwater study report, the Gingrich et al. So I think actually, do we have that map here? I believe this map on the wall here might show most of that. But if there's not enough to clarify, we're happy to follow up with some more. So let's move all the way to the northwest part of the critical groundwater area, to the Upper Silver Creek sub area. The Upper Silver Creek sub area is an example of one of the larger sub areas that we proposed here. So this sub area covers land surrounding the Silver Creek Valley, including Silver Creek and the lower reaches of its primary tributaries, Chickahominy Reservoir, Moon Reservoir, and the surrounding upland areas. The sub area covers from the western margin of the basin over to the head of Sagehand Creek, and from Dry Mountain down to the bottom of Moon Reservoir. Groundwater levels in the Upper Silver Creek sub area have declined over 10 feet in some areas, with a median annual decline rate of half a foot per year. So this is a relatively slow rate of decline and a relatively small magnitude of decline as seen in some other parts of the basin. So this map here again shows the distribution of total decline values across the area. And you can see that, the majority of wells have declined less than 5 feet. This is not an area where we're seeing serious declines, or where we have serious concerns at this point about the rate of decline occurring over there. Again, the map here is showing the contours for the deeper part of the groundwater flow system. And the sub area is defined broadly by an extensive flat hydraulic gradient as depicted by these contours. So you can see the contours are spread miles and miles apart, and you only see 10 feet of head difference between that. So this is an area where the groundwater gradient is just really very flat, and wells that are drilled down into that deeper part of the system all basically show the same water levels, the same seasonal trends, the same year-to-year trends across a very broad area in this part of the basin.
Well, question.
Yeah, Fred.
On that, I seem to remember you or the department, somebody talking about the shallow water table, and then one that's a little deeper, which happens in a number of different areas. But so what are we talking? Am I right on that? Or what are we?
Yeah.
Are we talking about the deeper profile, that where most of the irrigation wells are, versus the shallow one that's related to other factors?
That's right. So in this Upper Silver Creek sub area, and again, we have data sets for both the water table. We have a contour data set for the water table. What's shown here is the contour data set that represents groundwater levels in that deeper part of the groundwater flow system. So you're right. This is where most of the irrigation wells are going to be pulling their water. And so across a broad area, this deeper part of the groundwater flow system shows a very flat hydraulic gradient. Wells that are drilled into there show the same trends seasonally and from year to year.
And because I can't remember, what's the depth that we differentiate between the water table and the deeper system?
So to generate the contours for the deeper part of the groundwater flow system, we looked at wells that were generally deeper than 150 feet from land surface. So you can see here that the western and northern boundaries of the Upper Silver Creek sub area are simply defined by the extent of the Greater Harney Valley groundwater area of concern, the GIVGAC, our proposed critical groundwater area boundary. So this sub area runs right up to the exterior boundary of the proposed critical groundwater area. The southeastern boundary across here, I put these two groundwater flow direction arrows. That southeastern boundary is defined by a divergent groundwater flow gradient, where groundwater is flowing off the north over to the Sylvies area, and to the south down into the Upper Silver Creek sub area. The southern boundary, the northeastern boundary is defined by the USGS watershed boundary data set. And so that's the purple line on this map. The watershed boundary data set represents surface water drainage divides. And so you can see the eastern margin here of the Upper Silver Creek sub area follows pretty closely that surface water drainage divide. There. And I think that's all I had on Upper Silver Creek. So again, these are just a few examples, 3 or 4 that we stepped through today. There's 15 sub areas. For each of them, every part of their boundary is delineated based on these same types of factors. So I guess at this time, I want to open it up to the RAC for discussion on either these examples, the other 15 sub areas, the sub area map in general, questions about how the sub areas will be used. And specifically, I want to make sure that the RAC has a good understanding of this process that we use to delineate these sub area boundaries.
Go ahead, Mark.
Thanks, Brent. So Dark, I appreciate putting the sub areas over the contour map too. I think it would be valuable if we also overlaid that with the diversion points and any information you had on those points of diversion as far as well level, so people can start to visualize it. And also overlay on the geological map, because I think some of them are basically geological map. To me, I try to do some of that, it paints a better picture. And then even overlay then the pivots that are there. Because I think then we can start formulating more questions possibly than what we have right now. It's hard to go through multiple adaptive visualizing.
I agree. And there's, like you said, there's these multiple criteria, and it's difficult to put them all on a map at the same time. Certainly we can make separate thematic maps with each of the criteria, and provide those to the RAC. I think you're right. I think that would help to be able to see that. And I will say that, you know, if you look at the map here on the wall, and I apologize to those online that you can't see that, the map that shows the sub area with the contours, it's pretty clear that that was one of our most important criteria for delineating these sub areas, is really understanding groundwater flow directions, where these cones of depression are, and then the water level. Everything's kind of related. The water level decline data is related to that as well.
So I'll push back a little, Dark. I don't think it's too difficult if we put a map online where you could check the layers that you want. So then we could put 1 layer over top, put 2 layers over top, and put them all. So I think that'd be much more effective than doing several paper maps. Oregon Explorer, the Water Resource Department uses them. We could do it there. The county GIS is where I extrapolated them to. Bryce could overlay them with the overlays he already has, so we could go through and we could pick and choose which ones we want to see.
So Mark, I agree. I think you're right. We need to look at how to put that in ArcGIS online and make it a public map with the layers so that people can turn them on and off. I think that makes sense. And I think we can work on that over the next month to try to get that next meeting.
That's certainly the only way we're able to do it internally, right? We have the ArcGIS, we're turning these layers on and off, and you can consider things individually or together. And if we could get a tool to provide that to you all, that would be the best way for you to step through and understand how these boundaries were drawn.
Kristen, do you think Harnett County GIS could put that on their interactive water map layer?
Yeah, I believe they already have a contact with Bryce at the county that you can work through. If you need, any more help with it, please let us know, but that would be very helpful, and then it could be very available to the public.
Yep, I think that's a fantastic idea. And we can definitely work on that. We got hands up.
Yeah, so I captured that, that's a request, and we'll see what we can do to make that accessible here for the next meeting. Zach has a question. Zach, go ahead online.
Yeah, thanks, Stark, for that presentation. Really appreciate it. It's good to see how you're thinking about these sub areas. One thing I'd like to continue to talk about, you mentioned that the potentiometric contours were one of the key features that were delineating different sub areas. when you showed the Dog Mountain and Weaver Springs example, it sure looked like groundwater use in the Dog Mountain area was kind of merging with groundwater use impacts in the Weaver Springs area based on those contours. Can you go back to that? I'd like to maybe talk about that a little bit more, and can you revisit your rationale for why you think those are two separate sub areas rather than two areas that maybe at first glance could be perceived as just one bigger sub area where the groundwater use is affecting a larger cone of depression there?
Yeah, and you're right, Zach. The impacts of groundwater pumping across those two areas are merging, and the contours clearly demonstrate that. We talked about it a bit at the last RAC. I tried to highlight it again here today. Just the difference in the magnitude and the rates of decline that are occurring in the heart and inner periphery of that main cone of depression, as opposed to what's happening south of Wright's Point. And anytime you put a line on a map like this, you have to pick an area where the data seem to indicate that there's a transition occurring. And that's what we attempted to do here, using the contours, using the subsurface materials. But ultimately, I mean, you can look here at Dog Mountain, Weaver Springs. You can look anywhere in the basin, and it's a continuum. It's a single groundwater flow system. Pumping in one area at some time interval, it can have impacts in other areas. And so that's the challenge, not only here at Dog Mountain, Weaver Springs, but really everywhere across the basin when we're trying to delineate these sub areas. This is one particularly challenging example, I agree, because those contours are enclosed and concentric across that area. But taken as a whole, subsurface materials, the rates and magnitudes of declines, the differences in those rates and magnitudes, we really do believe that keeping them as two separate sub areas is the most appropriate approach moving forward. I'd be happy to take your thoughts further on that, Zach, if you have some to share.
Yeah, thanks. I'll think about that a little bit more, maybe submit some comments when I've digested it a bit further. I think my sense is that these are pretty, I hear you on the rates of decline, but broadly speaking, these seem pretty hydrogeologically similar based on what I know about these areas. So I would just continue to think about this particular example, Darek, and I would see this as an area where I'd want to kind of talk more and continue the conversation about what it means from a management perspective to have two smaller sub areas versus one larger sub area.
Absolutely, and that will certainly be coming into play. So, Zach, I think you're right. This is one that I think everybody's going to look at and have that question like right off the bat. Why are these two separated? And I'm happy to keep having that conversation with folks.
So I think he's going to provide some clarification here, and then you got John S. online, and we'll go back here to Fred.
Yeah, Zach, Dark and I talked about this area quite a bit. One of the things we talked about quite a bit was, bang for your buck. Another way of saying, timely and efficient. And when we were looking at, if we were to do something in the Dog Mountain area, would we see a timely response in the Weaver Springs area and vice versa? And when we looked at it more closely, our answer was yes. When you look at the contours, it makes sense to put them together. But when you look at the timing of the response, to do something in Dog Mountain and expect to see a timely response in the Weaver Springs area, we weren't seeing it in a manner that would be, if you're wanting to see something happen in a short term within the Weaver Springs, doing something in the Dog Mountain area wasn't going to get you there. And so we kicked it around quite a bit. And so that's where we came up with, we probably should keep these separate, but we're willing to entertain, additional thoughts on this.
Thank you.
That makes good sense. Thanks, Jerry. Appreciate the clarification.
John online.
Thank you. Hopefully, let's see, I'm not muted.
We hear you.
I gosh, I want to say I'm really impressed with the units and the subunits. I was expecting fewer units, and to have 15, it sure seems like it defines lots of different areas that I absolutely agree with. Obviously I tried to get a copy of of those subunits, GIS layer or shape file, so I could put it into ArcGIS, but apparently I don't have high enough clearance, so that wasn't allowed. But just what other people were saying there, it should be nice to be able to see it up against the groundwater layers or groundwater levels. And that's all I would say. I'm just impressed. I think you've done a great job. Thank you.
Thank you. Fred?
Yeah, I'm not real familiar with the details throughout that area, but my belief, based on what everybody's told me, there's extreme diversity, hydrogeologically type layers there that aren't clearly understood to this day, in my opinion. So I very, very much support separating them out the way you have. And I agree with John Short that that the sub areas I was pleasantly surprised in how you laid those out. There's lots of information that I have that it makes sense. I haven't studied them all, but when you go through the Wrights Point, Sunset Valley, the other side of Wrights Point, there's a lot of diversity there, and it is quite different. There's a little crossover hydrogeological formations, but it's quite a bit different than when you go to the southwest on the River Springs area that you have to find.
Thank you. Okay, any other questions? I guess more on how these were developed and the process that went into this. Anybody online, any questions?
Nobody's got their hand raised.
Okay. So this is a fluid process. Like I said, I'll put my cards over here if you have contacts already with the department. I think there's opportunity now to ask questions that get more granular on these sub areas, that we can help answer those between now and November and ongoing. Really, this conversation can continue along with the others that will be moving forward here. So, Mark, did you have
once we get the layers and we can start to look at things, will there be a time on the agenda at the next RAC meeting if questions come forward, email the department to possibly have a separate meeting to fine tune or have those discussions, or if there's not that many, do it in the meeting?
I think we can absolutely build in that time. I guess my question to the RAC is, how long do you think we'll want for that kind of conversation?
I don't, speaking for myself, until we can start comparing some of those areas, Tim, and we figure out if we have questions, maybe it's a half hour, maybe it's 4 hours. I don't know yet, because we haven't had the time to actually do a deep dive with email issues.
That's fair.
Yeah, so once we're able to get that information to you, point you to where it lives online, and then you have the time to look at it, we can kind of solicit input from the group and see where people are sitting on this, so we can properly plan for it. Go ahead.
So we have all the sub areas now. Are we 100% set, like the whole basin is going to be considered critical groundwater area? Or are we going to have a discussion if things actually are going to definitely be put in or not?
So it is still a proposal that the entire give-gag boundary be used as the critical groundwater area boundary. I think if you have strong feelings about that and you want to discuss that, we absolutely should do that.
I don't know, maybe I'm the only one, but I don't think that every sub basin warrants putting in, just because I guess I don't, maybe the question is, in the rules, is it going to say what each sub basin, like obviously some of these are going to have their own little rules of, curtailment. But the ones that aren't subject to curtailment, is it gonna specifically say that in the rules? Because I don't want to like sit here and we get it all done and 2 years later you get a letter in the mail and say, oh, by the way, surprise, you guys are being curtailed because you are in a critical groundwater area, and we're allowed to do that because it says that in the rules.
So yes, so that's a really good question. So in the critical groundwater area rules, we have to define in rule what the boundaries are and then what the permissible total withdrawal is, right? And the PTW is the amount of pumpage allowed per sub area and for the entire critical groundwater area. So if we decide not to curtail in a sub area, let's call it sub area A to keep everything hypothetical. If in sub area A, we're not going to curtail, then we would write in rule that the permissible total withdrawal for that area is going to be X, and likely that would match either the current groundwater use or the authorized groundwater use within that area. And so without a rule change, we could not curtail that sub area because we could not go and issue an order, and by we, I mean the commission as a whole, could not issue an order curtailing use to below that number. So having the sub areas defined does not mean that they'll be curtailed, and whatever ends up in the final rule sets up the future management schema for that sub area, and any orders have to match with those rules.
Okay, so if you're not gonna curtail a sub area, why put it in the critical? Why designate it critical if you're not gonna do anything with it? Because it could be added later if it needs to be.
Correct. So remember that curtailment is not the only tool we have in a critical groundwater area. We can also deny all applications.
Right, but couldn't that be a separate thing that's not because you're not in a critical?
It is not possible for the department to deny applications outright outside of a critical groundwater area. We do not have the authority.
But in basin rule though.
Even in basin rules, we cannot prevent, because the statute specifically states it has to be a critical groundwater area in order to outright deny an application.
You cannot process them though for eternity.
You just you're doing now since April 2016. Tim.
We can classify, but any applicant could ask for a waiver from the commission against that classification and potentially get a waiver from the commission and get a groundwater permit approved. The critical groundwater area would allow us to block the submittal of an application complete. And so that's one potential reason. Another reason is that it will allow us, or could allow us, to set ourselves up for thresholds, at which point we would come back and do a future rulemaking to curtail. So we have groundwater declines happening throughout the entirety of the critical groundwater area, like within the give-yak boundary. And they're happening at different rates. And they're happening and we have different magnitudes. And so by putting it all into a framework with thresholds, we can help incentivize voluntary groundwater reduction, because it would let everyone in that sub area know that when we cross this threshold, then we're looking at going back to a rulemaking and further action from a regulatory standpoint. And so it sets up the basin as a whole to continue to focus on voluntary reduction of groundwater use to prevent crossing certain thresholds. So that would be another reason why we are considering a larger boundary with sub areas within it for targeting or prioritizing curtailment in specific areas. Alexandra.
It's also helpful to remind folks on the RAC and members of the public that the give-yak is an administrative boundary that our funding opportunities are contingent upon. So the PrEP program uses the give-yak boundary, and the Harney Domestic Well Remediation Fund also uses the give-yak as a boundary. So thinking about those funding opportunities for residents in Harney County is also important to think about with regards to the critical groundwater area designation.
But to be clear, we don't have to tie the critical groundwater area boundary to the give yak. But we will leave the give yak in rule no matter what because of those funding opportunities.
That understood. Go ahead. I have a quick question here. Yeah.
I want to hear your definition of curtail and your definition of deny. What's in your mind when you say curtail and then deny? Within these sub areas?
So when I say denying an application, it would mean that
For a new well.
Not for a new well, for a new groundwater right. Because we can't prevent new wells from being drilled. We can prevent new groundwater rights from being authorized. So when I say deny, we would deny any new applications. We simply wouldn't accept them. When we talk about curtailment is when we prevent authorized groundwater users from using their permitted water as part of a critical groundwater area and reducing groundwater usage. And in the Division 10 rules, which are our rules that define how a critical groundwater area is designated and what can be done, and that refers back to our critical groundwater area statutes, we are required to set a permissible total withdrawal. And that permissible total withdrawal is the amount of allowed pumpage, so the amount of allowed groundwater use. And that will likely come in the form of an acre foot number. And then that permissible total withdrawal has to be allocated to groundwater users. And it can be afforded preferentially to residential or stockwater uses first. But then after that, it has to be allocated based on the system of prior appropriation. So senior users get their full right first, and junior users would be curtailed off completely, and somewhere in the middle where you may have a right that gets part of their total allowable or their total authorized water.
That's the way it's always been, though, right? Senior always is.
That's the system of prior appropriation, yes.
Good question. So yeah, everyone capture that. In simplest terms, curtailment is.
We're gonna talk more about that after the break. Too.
Yeah.
Total permissible withdrawal.
Yeah, so after the break, we're gonna start talking about the criteria for curtailment and how we're gonna prioritize which sub areas are regulated or receive regulatory curtailment, and how we define that, and then are able to apply that.
Okay, any other questions on the boundaries in the sub areas? There's gonna be more data coming, so we're working on that. Go ahead, Kathleen.
Well, I want to go back a little bit to what she was saying before, because if, like you were bringing up, if the sub area wasn't considered a critical groundwater area, would that disallow that sub area from participating in any voluntary agreements?
A voluntary agreement can be entered into by any groundwater users within the same groundwater reservoir anywhere in the state.
With critical or not?
Critical or not.
Okay.
We'd love to see it in areas that are not critical and aren't on our radar right now for critical, but I have groundwater declines. We'd love to see it anywhere in the state. Absolutely.
Would a voluntary agreement potentially allow users within a similar sub-basin an opportunity to not use their full allocation without being hurt by not using their full allocation?
A voluntary agreement can control in lieu of an order from the department or from the commission. If it meets the goals of the Groundwater Act. So if that voluntary agreement is as strict in curtailment as the regulation is going to be, then absolutely. And that could allow users within a sub area, instead of having to follow prior appropriation, they could agree that everybody gets a certain amount of water as long as it doesn't exceed the permissible total withdrawal for that sub area. Does that answer your question? Did I make it clear?
Speak exactly though to whether if say they were not to use their full 3 acre feet of water. So if they all agreed to use less than that amount, then that is allowed within a voluntary agreement. So say they were to transition to a crop that wasn't as intensive and didn't need that full allocation, And as long as that agreement was made within that sub area, critical groundwater area or not, that could be proposed to the department.
Correct. And I think I'm starting to understand your question a little bit better. And forgive me if I don't get this right, but if you're a senior user and you decide to use 2 acre-feet instead of your authorized 3 acre-feet, does that voluntary agreement punish you? Well, not beyond what you agreed to, right? You can't then go out and use 3 acre-feet because you agreed to only use 2. But your authorized, your permit, your certificate will not be changed based on that. So you could, in the future, decide, I don't want to be a part of the voluntary agreement any longer, back out, and as a senior user, you would likely still be protected because the seniors get water first. And so you wouldn't be giving up anything that wasn't given up voluntarily, if that makes,
No, that
is that
was what I
more
was getting.
clear?
Yeah, just kind of trying to lay out what potential options could be put out there within a sub area.
Right.
And this might be better after the break. So when if a critical groundwater designation is set in rules, you have a total permissible withdrawal. Is that total, is the department or the commission have the ability to phase in the total permissible withdrawal? Or will that be 25? This is what you have to do, otherwise we're gonna start a contested case. Because if there's not a phase-in possibility for volunteer agreements, there's more incentive for us to litigate for 5 to 7 years and then go down to that total value than to try to work as a community for 5 to 7 years to get to that level.
So there is nothing that I have seen in statute or in rule that prevents us from a phased curtailment. So you could say, in year 1, we're going to curtail these users and because it has to follow prior appropriation, remember, so we'd have to shut off juniors first if it's regulatory. We would have to say, these junior users get curtailed in year 1, these junior users get curtailed in year 2, these junior users get curtailed in year 3.
It might be best to say this amount would have to be curtailed in 1, this amount would be curtailed in 2.
But that at the end of the day,
if the department does it, it has to be strictly by appropriate.
Absolutely.
That if the community decides something different, there's a different option.
absolutely, and that's a really good, I really appreciate you phrasing it that way, Mark. That does help reframe it for the group, I think, because you're right. We could look at it from a total number standpoint, and then the users in that area have to figure out how to get to that number by that timeline. Otherwise, we go to regulation, and that would further incentivize that voluntary action. Absolutely. I appreciate that. Thank you.
I have a question.
Mhm.
So when you're envisioning voluntary agreements, let's say in a discussion by sub area, is the vision of that it would be not just individuals, but groups of individuals? I mean, if you've got one person that signs a voluntary agreement in a sub area and there's 500 users, then it's not necessarily that helpful, correct?
Correct.
But it still is possible.
It is possible, but it would not. I doubt that would meet the commission's threshold for adopting that agreement and having that control in lieu of an order. I think in that situation, if you have 500 users and only one of them is willing to voluntarily curtail, we're going to push forward with regulation.
So then it's still gonna put the onus on the community to come up with bundled voluntary.
Absolutely, it has to be the users of a groundwater reservoir. Yeah. Mark.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Tell me it's not true that the department is planning on doing a rulemaking on volunteer agreements before we have the time to try some pilots?
I don't know that I understood your question.
Kelly does.
There are currently no plan.
There's no plan. Rulemaking for volunteer.
Yes. Okay.
Thanks, Kelly.
You're welcome. That's I'm the road writer. I got you.
So Plymouth Larissa's point on Upper Silver Creek, and you go south of Mount Lake, which now has two sub areas, upper Blitz and lower Blitz voltage. Like in that particular area, you have very few wells, irrigation wells, groundwater usage wells until you get to the northeast corner. And again, there's lots of diversity in there. What is the benefit? There's not a lot of data there either. What is the benefit of that area or the upper Silver Creek for that matter? To a little lesser degree, but still somewhat similar to the department, how to create a system of management and water use planning overall, right? All I see is, I guess I see lots of negatives from being in that particular area when the level of data is just almost non-existent until you get to two primary irrigation areas and they're small. I guess I don't see a benefit, but I don't see a real reason to have that whole southern part in the critical groundwater area, and for that matter, Silver Creek either. But anyway, I'm sure the department disagrees with me on that, but you know, we've changed their mind. They've changed their mind on how those flows actually function in that area, and where the recharge areas primarily are. So I just don't see a lot of positives from the groundwater use perspective of having that part of the critical area. It kind of gives everyone in these areas, it kind of gives everybody, I like the differentiation of the sub areas because at least then we can argue our case and we're not lumped automatically. And so I like that part of it. Because there's a lot of difference sub area to sub area, but I just really have a hard time. That Malheur Lake is a separation. Groundwater, all groundwater is connected. I understand. It's such a different cat from everything to the north. I just, anyway, I basically disagree with it being a critical groundwater.
Okay, so Fred, can I ask a question then?
Sure.
Can you expand on then if there's no curtailment in those areas, let's just say that there's not going to be curtailment, but as I said, one of the strategies is to try to put thresholds in place to make sure we don't see groundwater declines past a certain point.
Okay.
What are those negatives that you said of being in the critical area or having those sub areas in the critical area?
Well, one of the negatives is, and these would be small areas and not a large level of use. I'm thinking of one landowner particularly because he was conservative. You know, he has some of the best farmland that has holes in it, and you pump water at 20 feet. One pivot or one well can run 3-4 pivots. To me, that's a lost opportunity because that particular landowner is so conservative, and there really is no other irrigators nearby until you get clear to the east. That I just think that's. If I was extremely confident that water, because there's no data really saying it's in decline at all. To me, they're getting the penalty for broader overall problems further not connected. So I understand the point you're making. I look on the other opportunity at the individual level. I mean, there will never be on the south end because there's not a lot of private land, there's not a lot of, you know, there would not be a whole bunch of water use, but at the time that the department decided to add and I agree with it, don't get me wrong on that, the northeast portion, what I call Black Butte, there's quite a flow of water to the south of Black Butte. And I believe that is some of the same water that flow goes east there. But until that area was added to the Donner Blitzen was perfect, no, the 20,000 acre feet to the plus, not the deficit. So I guess just the level of data and the individual opportunities of that landowner, I'm thinking of their grid operators, and he invested his life in that opportunity. And yeah, he wasn't on the ball. He should applied for more than what he had money for. Anyway, that's all. You get the point.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful.
Yeah, and we'll capture this, and again, you know, some of this feedback specific to the sub-regions and borders. You know, continue providing that. We got one question online, and then we'll go here. So Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Fred, for bringing that up. I see it a different way. I don't agree with you that that south area should not be included in the critical groundwater designation area. I believe it should. As development increases and continues in the Blitzen Valley, we'll see more and more impacts above and beyond what we've already witnessed with spring outflows. This gives us an opportunity to address the potential impacts in the future from increasing groundwater withdrawals and prevent the situation that we're seeing in Weaver Springs and elsewhere in the Give Gap. So I guess I'll push back on you, Fred, quite substantially, because I think that, as has already been said, this is one large groundwater system, and we can't start piecemeal managing it without missing an opportunity to achieve reasonably stable groundwater management objectives.
Yeah, go ahead and respond, Fred, and then
Yeah,
we'll go over next.
well, quickly, yeah, because I understand what you're looking at on, like the Sawdell Spring. I don't know that we understand everything going on there, but the springs primarily are on elevation when you're way above any of the groundwater usage. So I guess I'd push back a little bit on what you said, only because, and I think we'd agree on this part, that we need to understand the increase or decrease of functions in spring related geological formations that exist there. Your point's well made.
Thank you. Back here in the corner, and then John Short online.
Not really, sorry, it's kind of off what Fred's talking about. I was just wondering, because we're talking about getting overlays for map. Do you guys have, or can you get the actual usage for each sub area, like how much acre feet or whatever is being used in each sub area, so that when we go talk about curtailment, we actually know what the numbers are going to look like or what you guys perceive?
Okay, so
Does that make?
yes, so let me rephrase it and make sure that I understood. So what you're looking for is authorized use by permit, which I think we provided some of that already.
Right.
Then you want to see actual current usage.
Well, yeah, I guess for like, but divided by sub areas so that
Then, okay,
we
so,
know what
right.
we're talking about.
Yep, so we started by providing the entire study area of rights. Now you want to split those out by sub area.
Yeah.
So that we can see the rights by sub area, so we know what the authorized usage is. And then were you also asking for what we believe the current usage is based on what the study
2.4 something acre feet
found? Is
We
that
want paper water and we want wet water.
okay? So Jerry?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the plan is by sub area. What's the authorized use per sub area? And then what we're looking at is for the USGS model, we put together water usage from 1930 to 2018. So we're looking at 2017, 2018 average per sub area.
Okay, John Short online.
Yeah, I would have to say that I agree with Fred on that that lower Blitzen voltage sub area. And maybe my understanding will help once I've seen the contour lines and things, but it sure seems like you've got a number of irrigators that are over by voltage, and then you have a number of irrigators that are in was that Anderson Valley, or the northeast portion there. Hard to imagine cutting back across that entire region being really fair. I guess to me it seems like it should be two regions, because I guess when I think of it, I can't, it doesn't seem like cutting back in voltage would result in anything that you would see at the northeast corner of that, where my understanding that's really where a lot of the water from the basin kind of comes, aggregates and leaves the basin.
So John, are you saying that the lower Blitzen voltage sub area, you think that should be 2 sub areas and not 1?
That's what it seems like to me.
Okay.
Thank you for summarizing.
Oh, thank you for that. I wanted to make sure I understood you.
And Tim, if you're not familiar with the names he's throwing out, he's delineating the eastern side.
Yeah, so if you look at the big POD one, I assume he's talking about up here in sort of the, isn't that like going in towards Virginia Valley?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm still learning my geography down here. I haven't spent enough time driving around. So.
Hey, guys, I'd just like to point out there's been considerable dialogue in the chat. I don't know if you guys are all monitoring that, but folks like including RAC members are, they're seeing what's in the chat, and folks in the room maybe aren't privy to those conversations. So maybe we could, share sort of what's been going on in the chat with the folks in the room.
Yeah, thanks.
We'll do that now, and then that probably will take us, likely to the end of this agenda item. So let's go ahead and go there. Thank you.
Okay, so Stephen Patton asked, and Stephen's a member of the public, I believe, would a voluntary agreement prevent relinquishment of water rights that are not used? So, right, there's the forfeiture happens if you don't use your water right for more than 5 years for beneficial use, right? That's what's supposed to happen. So then Ken followed that up with good question. Would the lack of use under a voluntary agreement count towards forfeiture subject to cancellation? And Jason, and I'll let you chime in if you want here, but what Jason put in the chat, and Jason Spreed is our region manager based out of Baker, and he's responsible for this area as well. He said, we have not had voluntary agreements elsewhere in the state, but it should not impact water rights certificate limits. It certainly does not for surface water rotation agreements, which are similar. So joining a voluntary agreement doesn't mean that if you don't use your water during that voluntary agreement, because that's part of the agreement, that your right would be canceled. And so Ken followed that up with, I recognize it's an unclear area of the law, but there needs to be some assurance to overcome hesitancy to developing voluntary agreements. So as Jason said, we haven't had this tested before anywhere in the state because we don't have any groundwater voluntary agreements. But based on our experience with surface water rotation agreements, it shouldn't result in cancellation of a right if you're operating under a voluntary agreement and not using water.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions or comments to kind of round us out here on this topic area? So, after the break, we're going to get into the curtailment criteria. So that's sort of the other half of this, but, and then as I mentioned before, it sounds like where we're leading here from this discussion is developing more data, providing you the tools to be able to see this and all the different layers that exist. And, you know, maybe with some instruction on where you can access it, how you can interpret the information. But then taking some time on our agenda for November to circle back with any questions or comments that people had that were generated over the last month, you know, from the new data that we're able to share with you. Yes.
Yeah. I just got one question. Man, look at these flood areas. Some of these are extremely small. And, you know, I lived in Long for a while. And there's just not a lot of difference between, yeah, I mean, there's a few mountains over here, you know, on the Crane area, you know, on the backside, but then if you section off one whole section for lawn, which doesn't make a lot of sense, then you've got North Harney, which North Harney is just basically was a little area there, but as far as being different, I just don't understand how you team up with some of these very, very small areas. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, maybe Jerry, if you can answer that, just, you know, from the,
So
how these are developed.
some of these smaller areas are, if you look at the contour map, especially the deep contour level maps, you'll see that there's a concentrated cone of depression around Lawn in that North Harney Valley area, and so that's why they got singled out, because the cone hasn't spread over a large geographic area, so we do a smaller sub area to represent that cone of depression. And that's the same with the Harney, I mean, the North Harney area, I mean, there's a small of an area that's got. Yeah.
And this map here has the contours with the sub areas. I think that'll.
Yeah, if you look at the, on the wall map, we have the contours on. So, okay, let me get this straight. So in this area, you've had a huge influx of pivots, and that has brought the water level down in that small area. And so, in fact, in North Harney, the groundwater flow has reversed direction, but on the south side of that cone depression in North Harney, you've got water flowing instead of south towards Mount Here Lake, it's flowing back north towards that cone depression. You have to go some distance south before it goes south again. And that's happening in the Weaver Springs area too, correct? In fact, it's not, you're flowing north to south, it's flowing south to north. Well, so water that would normally go to Harney Lake is now moving towards Weaver Springs, right? Into that cove. Yeah, that makes more sense to me, because I was sitting here going. Because I remember the flood, I remember how that water moved around, I mean, an inch of water went freaking 30 miles, 40 miles. And, okay, that makes sense.
Great, thank you. Any other questions?
So so then it makes sense in one aspect of my mind. So if you look at these maps, it's pretty much where, you know, 15, 20, 25 pivots are together. Those will come under regulation. Now you have one that might be 2 miles over here, but because he's 2 miles separate, you're probably never come under regulation. You might have a more junior water right. He is using the same water. It might take 5 years to get there, but because he was separated, he's not going to come under regulation in the near future. So it makes an interesting dynamic if you're one of those that's in a congested area.
Which I am.
Well,
Okay.
I mean,
That makes a whole lot more sense to me, because I was sitting there going, because I've been all over this valley and, you know, for years, and looking at this, making sense. So, thank you. Yeah, Mark brings up a good point, and we don't have a good answer to it, because our number of isolated cones of depression that are just out there isolated. They haven't coalesced into other cones of depression to be, you know, like the ones that we captured. And so the question is, you know, what, and I think this is kind of a future discussion thing, you know, what happens with it? It may be that majority of them, we haven't looked at the dates of the priority date. You know, that a number of them may be junior water rights that have a decline condition built into them. And so that's the way they get captured, is under their decline condition.
So last thing.
Suggesting that we should shut them off, I would just.
Noted for the record, Mark. Really quick, the last thing, then I have to go use the bathroom. Ivan posted ORS 540.610.3.3. It basically says, notwithstanding subsection 1 of this section, if the owner of a perfected and developed water right uses less water to accomplish the beneficial use allowed by the right is not subject to forfeiture so long as A, the user has a facility capable of handling the entire rate and duty authorized under the right, and B, the user is otherwise ready, willing, and able to make full use of the right.
That opens up a whole Pandora that we don't want to talk about for the next hour on. Yep, this is down where you're not ready, willing, and able.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So,
Please
let's take a
continue
break.
reading.
Sorry, say that again?
Please continue reading.
So Ken asked, thanks, does this prevent them from selling off their pivot and pump? And John says, but no beneficial use is occurring if they're fallowing fields voluntarily or from regulation.
Because that ORS said if the user can accomplish the beneficial use allowed by the right, we're in a desert.
So it goes to the point where in critical groundwater designation, they're not actually canceling your water right. They draw you up for more than 5 years, but you still have a water right there.
Correct.
The department is making a determination you can't use the water. So you're not subject to forfeiture of the water right. You get the water right, you just can't use it.
Yeah. That is how I would interpret that. But I think, John, if you'd like us to, we can definitely follow up on that and come back with more information. That would be beneficial.
Thank you. I'd appreciate, I think it's to your benefit, yeah.
Okay, absolutely. All right, we're gonna take a break.
Yep, break time, 2:50, just don't go too far, we'll come back.
Great. Did everybody online hear us?
Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Everybody grab your seats. Move on to the next agenda item, the criteria for curtailment. Again, kind of similar to the previous one, this is some. We want your input and your feedback on what's being presented. We're not gonna look at this granularly in a sub area or on the ground, but rather the criteria that would be applied for then potential curtailment to occur in some areas in the future. So really just looking for feedback and input on what's being presented here as a criteria, not necessarily on the ground.
And then just really quick to note, there were more comments related to the cancellation and forfeiture of rights. We're gonna go take those, summarize them, go through them, and then we'll send something out to the RAC with more information on that piece as related to voluntary agreements. Jerry, go for it.
So, for those who don't know me, I'm Jerry Grondin, hydrogeologist in the groundwater section of the Oregon Water Resources Department for 2 more months. And then I'm done.
Congratulations, Jerry, you get to retire.
So you can beat me up for 2 more months. So Dark, at our last meeting and then today, talked about the sub areas. And so we're here to talk about the criteria for ranking or prioritizing the sub areas for curtailment. And so what's being presented here is independent of whatever sub area we talk about or how they're defined. We're talking about, once we agree upon the sub areas, how are we going to rank them from highest to lowest priority for potential curtailment? So what we're talking about is proposed criteria for prioritizing or ranking critical groundwater sub areas for curtailment. Then we're going to talk about an example of applying the criteria to a particular sub area. Since we've been talking about Weaver Springs, that's the one. And then we'll have time for the RAC to discuss and provide feedback.
So what we're proposing as criteria for prioritizing the sub areas for curtailment. We came up with four different things to look at. One would be looking at the decline rates. And then, ranking the sub areas that have the greatest to the least rate of decline going on within those sub areas. Now, getting back to, I don't see Fred, but Fred talked about, the time period. So we're talking about a time period of 2016 to present for looking at those decline rates. Because, with transfers that happen, you could have a period of a high decline rate, and then a transfer comes in and that use is moved to a different area, and the decline rate may have decreased in a particular area. The other thing that we're talking about looking at is looking at the total decline within the history of the wells that are within that sub area. And so what is the greatest total decline and ranking those sub areas that have the largest total decline versus sub areas that have the smaller total decline. Another thing we're offering up is looking at groundwater elevations that are below the elevation of 4,080 feet. And where do we come up with that number? That's approximately the bottom elevation of Harney Lake. So we're looking at groundwater levels, ranking them, sub areas that have groundwater levels that are way deep below that versus sub areas that are close to the bottom of Harney Lake, or versus sub areas that still have groundwater levels above now here in Harney Lake. And then a fourth criteria, those sub areas that have a well-defined cone of depression within them. There's some sub areas that don't, and then there's some sub areas that do have a well-defined cone of depression.
Great, Mark. Question for you.
Jerry, so when you say one or more,
so
you argue the point that it should be an average of the wells in that area. Because if we look up at the northeast part, we know there's some anomaly wells that have gone, we know there's some anomaly wells like in the northeast part that have gone down a long ways. There's not to say that there's not some of those heterogeneous geology that one well or two wells in a sub area is showing not a standard rate. So if you say one well that's gone down more than 70 foot, I think it should be an average of the wells in a sub area. Somehow we should look at the average of the wells in a sub area instead of picking one or two that might not be representative of the area.
Your point's well taken, and there's several ways we can approach it. And this is what we can, do during the discussion period, taking this kind of feedback. One way is to tally up the number of wells that, have, different rates of decline, between this window and that window. We have, where we can run statistics on the wells that, we, have, for all the wells that we do have a decline rate, run statistics on those. So there's different ways of presenting that kind of information, and then looking at, how to rank the sub areas based on that. And that's kind of the feedback we're looking for, at the end of this presentation. But your point is well taken.
You want me to wait till the end and make a comment, Gary? Is that what you're saying?
No,
it's okay. I got it captured up here, so we'll get to it.
Okay.
Brad, they want us to wait till the end before we make them.
I think I picked up on that.
Wait till the end to do what? Well, I can see you now. I had to get my eyes.
Go ahead, Jerry.
So, like I said, just for the sake of argument, let's say we want to prioritize a sub area, that, shows a decline rate of 3 feet per year or greater, or shows a total groundwater level decline exceeding 50 feet, or, has a groundwater elevation below the 40-80 foot elevation, or, has a well-developed cone of depression. Well, since Dark talked about Weaver Springs, let's look at Weaver Springs. In Weaver Springs, we have all four of those things happening. We have a decline rate of 3 feet or per year or greater. We do have wells with a groundwater level decline exceeding 50 feet over the life at that well. We do have a well-defined cone of depression, and we do have groundwater elevations below the 40, 80 foot elevation. So, we do, like I've said, available data indicates that there are multiple wells declining greater than 3 feet per year. Those are the green dots on this particular map. Different projections. Can you see the green dots? Okay. And then, we do have multiple wells within that sub area that have a total decline more than 50 feet. That's the red dots on this map. We do have groundwater elevations below the 40, 80 foot elevation. On this map, the lowest elevation contour at the center of that cone of depression is 4,000 feet. So 80 feet below Harney Lake. And we do have a well-developed cone of depression, moving the lowest groundwater elevation from Harney Lake to the Weaver Springs area and redirecting groundwater flow, that would normally go to Harney Lake over towards the cone of depression there at Weaver Springs. So, here's a case where, all the criteria that would be set for ranking, would put the Weaver Springs area, if these are the criteria, in the high priority category. If that's what we run with. So, we're proposing these four as criteria. And so the question is do these ranking criteria, meet the RAC expectations, or do you have other expectations? Do you have additional suggestions for criteria? And then once we have these things ranked, what should be the curtailment goals per sub area? What should be the goal for moderating the groundwater level decline rate? What should be the goal for moderating the total level of decline? Do we want it, just, this is the level of no lower, or do we want some recovery? That's a part of the discussion. What do we do about the groundwater elevations that are below the Mount Hare Lake and Harney Lake elevations? And then what do we do about moderating the cones of depression? Do we just kind of freeze them where they are, or do we want to see them start recovering? And so, then we're, any other questions or discussions, related to that topic. And so that's, kind of in a nutshell, just wanted to throw that out there to get the discussion going.
So that's a lot of questions, obviously. So maybe we start with the first one.
So in terms of criteria, what are your thoughts on the criteria? Mark.
A couple on the four of them. One, I suggested that we look at an average of the wells. If you have one or two anomalies or 3 or 4 anomalies that below 50 foot, that would be interesting to me. I think there's potential that you unfairly represent a whole area. I'd like to understand what is the definition of a well-defined cone. Is that 2 gradient lines of 20 feet? Is that 100 foot depression? What is a well-defined cone of depression? I'll throw it out here. Lisa, Zach, get ready. What is magical about 4080 except that it is the Harney Lake level? What does it matter that we have changed some of the distribution of the water? Weaver Springs in our lifetime, our kids' lifetime, is never gonna get back to 40/80. We know that. So why are we setting an arbitrary, maybe not an arbitrary, but why are we setting a number for a goal that cannot be achieved in some of the areas that have already declined past that? I'm gonna leave it at that.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Oh, yeah.
So how many, you said an average, how many wells is enough?
I
To
don't
make
know,
a
it
decision.
depends on how many wells, these are sub areas are so different.
Yeah.
And there's so many points of diversion, we'll have to evaluate that. I don't think an arbitrary, I can't throw out an arbitrary number.
Okay.
Because it would be arbitrary without more information.
Dark, you've got a thought on that?
I'll just say that using an average is problematic for a variety of reasons in a lot of cases, and especially for that total magnitude value case, because you do have variable periods of record. So there may be in a sub area two or three wells that show 50 feet of total decline, but the other 30 wells might only have a period of record going back to 2015. 2016, and that's not representative of the declines that have occurred in that sub area. So just averaging those, that average number, it doesn't have a lot of meaning to it, right? As far as being representative of the declines that have occurred.
Well, I'm gonna throw it back at you.
Please, yeah.
We've drawn lines, contour lines that aren't representative of the age of the wells. They're contour lines based on the map they've drawn, irregardless of how long that well's in production. So if you're gonna use that logic, throw out all those lines, because you didn't use period of record where you drew the period of record.
Well, the water level contours are a snapshot in time of water levels in 2018,
right? Which we used to draw those.
Right.
So it's contrary to what you're saying that we should look at.
No, the water level contours don't need a period of record. They're not time series data. That's one data point for many wells across the entire basin for 2018 were used to draw those contour lines. They don't actually represent any rates of decline or any magnitudes of decline. They represent the elevation at a specific period of time, right? So not to say that there aren't potentially some issues with data density in some areas on the contours. I'm not saying they're perfect in every case, but it's a different type of data problem when you're drawing contours than when you're trying to interpret trend data or magnitudes or rate.
My last comment. So the person that drilled the oldest well in the basin is gonna be the one that's gonna be penalized first. He's more than likely to have the time to drop more than anything else.
Is it in the water, right?
I mean, if it's drilled first, more than likely, but I mean, that's the logic.
Well, yeah.
That's my interpretation of.
Yeah, so from it, that's a really good, I think this is a really good conversation to have around data. And you're absolutely right. Our most representative historic data is gonna be from the oldest wells. And that is, I don't know how to get around that, right?
Like, why, but it's just an observation and when we.
Yeah.
That we're penalizing the ones that first started production potentially.
Presumably they're seniors.
Yeah.
But seniors, when you start dividing into 15 subcategories, changes the whole dynamic. Because you're only looking at a priority date in a sub area, you're not looking at a priority date in a basin. So if I was magically a half foot out of the line, the priority dates change. I'm not arguing that the data is not what we need to be looking at management on, but I'm just, when you ask about the 4 criteria, that's my thoughts.
Yeah, for sure.
Good, Jerry, and then we got Zach online, and we'll come over here.
You asked about the 40-80 foot contour, and I think, that's a discussion, in terms of, what is the community's goal, the number is, if you take it below the 40-80, what happens, does it start impacting the groundwater dependent ecosystem that we hear from the Zach Frieds in the world? Does it affect, the spring discharge, at Sod House Spring? Does it affect this, the springs over in Warm Springs Valley? So, those are the kind of questions, that, do we care or not? And if we don't care, then then you can pick it lower. But if you do care, and you start impacting those systems, that the community may value, or, the community is forced to value because of some, federal regulation or something, that is something, you need to figure out, as a community as to, is this important or not?
If I could just quickly expand on the 40-80 contour thing, I think a really simple way to think about it is if groundwater level declines in a particular area of the basin are below that 40-80 level, that's a clear sign that there's a significant perturbation to the groundwater system in that area. And there's lots of other details and considerations around what does that mean? Is that important? But it's a flag that indicates to us pretty clearly that something significant has happened there.
So we got Zach online, we'll go here, back here, and then we'll check what we got in the chat. Zach, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I've been enjoying this discussion on data. I think it's a good one to have. I do think that the types of questions being asked here are in line with my expectations and what I'd like to see. I think it's important to understand for each sub area, what does the total rate of decline over time look like? And what do the total declines that we are aware of over any space of time, what does that look like? Those are well aligned with how I think we can prioritize these sub areas. But I am sympathetic to the idea that, like, yeah, data availability is going to be different for each of those sub areas, and some of those sub areas might have a lot more data than others. And so what I'd appreciate seeing some just descriptive statistics about some of these sub areas in future conversations that look at how much time series data do we really have to assess these trends, and what's the range of trends, the median of trends, and like the maximum declines for each sub area. And I feel like if we have that information, if we have the range, the median, and the maximum declines, then that's going to provide the information that the rulemaking committee might need to really prioritize this. So anyway, I support that approach. I think the 40-80 feet above mean sea level, I like that conceptually, but I worry that focusing too much on that as a prioritization is going to limit the ability of management actions to benefit higher up in the basin areas where declines may be affecting groundwater dependent ecosystems or domestic well users in other parts of the basin. I understand the rationale behind that 40-80 feet threshold, but that's of course going to spatially bias towards the bottom of the basin where management actions take place. And I'm aware that that's also where a lot of the groundwater use is taking place, but it's just something I want to think more about.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, you say you don't like averages. Why couldn't you take priority dates, 10-year priority dates, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, average those out? And that would be a more accurate deal than penalizing the senior water right, saying eventually you guys are going to come in and say, no, you got to reduce anyway, even though you're the senior water right, senior water user, if it keeps going down. So what's wrong with going in the 10-year slots or 5-year slots for wells or priority dates and getting the averages there? Because Mark's right, the guy that drilled the well 50 years ago is going to get penalized probably the worst because his well's gone so far down.
Well, okay, so I think I get what you're saying, and please jump in and correct me if I'm not. So just because a well has declined more than 50 feet or has a decline rate of more than 3 feet in this example, doesn't mean that the right associated with that well would be curtailed at all. That's criteria that we're going to apply to the entire sub area.
Oh, yes.
And remember that we then have to, if we're going to regulate that sub area, we have to regulate by priority date. So if you have the oldest well with the longest period of record and it shows greater than 50 feet of decline, and we include that in our criteria for curtailment, and then we go and we curtail that sub area, we have to start with the most junior user in that sub area first and curtail them first. And then it will depend on what the permissible total withdrawal is for that sub area, how many users are allowed to pump, or how many users are curtailed. And whether or not that specific well gets curtailed off will depend on its priority date, not based on its water level.
But you're measuring by water level across the whole sub-area,
Correct.
correct?
Yes.
So why can't you not take the average of the whole sub-area and break it down to where you have this group here was drilled in the water rights in the 70s, water rights in the 80s, water rights in the 90s, and get a full platform of the whole sub-area instead of just saying the people with the junior water rights that we measure our wells, static levels every year, report them to you guys. But the wells that were drilled back in the 70s, late 60s, 70s, 80s, there's no requirement for that. There's no requirement for static level in March, where they got to go out there and measure static levels. So you guys have no data on those wells whatsoever. So, but yet you're gonna go shutting water off because of the small group of the latest round of water. So what's the cutoff date? I'm not sure what the cutoff date is.
Well, we haven't gotten.
No, hear me out.
Yeah,
Hear my question.
absolutely.
What's the cut? When did WRD start requiring static level checks, yearly checks on new wells?
Those permit conditions went in what, the 90s?
Yeah, 90s. Because it wasn't required on our older stuff that was in early 2000s. There was no requirements there. The current property we have now, the requirement is there for a static level in March.
Right.
But in those are more junior than the ones we used to have, but those were 2000 water rights there, and we had no requirements to report a static level to WRD.
Right.
So
with, I want to dig more into your priority date question. So what you're saying is, let's take a sub area, just for example, Weaver Springs.
Okay.
And we've got 5 wells, and these are just totally made up numbers, all right? Hypothetical. We've got 5 wells that were drilled between 1950 and 1960. And we got 5 wells that were drilled between 60 and 70. We got 5 wells that were drilled between 70 and 80. 5 wells between 80 and 90, et cetera,
yes,
right?
Yes.
So you've got an even distribution, and we've got water levels for each of those sets of wells. We should average the magnitude of decline, so the total amount of decline in each group of wells, and then average it all together.
Yes.
Or okay,
That's
so that would be that's an approach to allow. I'm not sure I'm not sure how to phrase what that would accomplish. But let us think about that. If that's what if I understood what you
you're saying that averages are bad. But well, that's what he said over there, right? I'm sorry, I forgot your name, but you don't like averages.
They're problematic for a number of reasons.
Right. So, but if you're only getting data on the newer junior water right wells.
Sure.
But if you get your data from the newer water right wells, that usually would skew you from having a smaller total decline than because your period of record is shorter. So if you triggered the criteria, you've had something happen in a shorter amount of time. For instance, think of the crane area. Their decline rate, is around a foot a year. It didn't grab a lot of people's attention. The USGS, when they studied back in the 1960s, kind of raised a yellow flag saying, something's going on here. You might want to keep an eye on it. But it just kind of slipped under the radar. And then in the early 2000s, we started getting phone calls like, we got a problem out here. You guys need to come out here and start checking this out. And, but, again, the decline rate was still about a foot a year on an annual basis. But when you look at the data from the 1960s to present, that foot a year started adding up over that multi-decade period. And so, it's kind of like, do you bleed out from a big gash, or do you bleed out from a bunch of small cuts, type of situation?
So I think we're gonna need to have more of a conversation around the data and around how we are looking at the sub-area statistics for magnitude and rate. Is that fair to say, the group? We want to talk about that more. And maybe we'll put together statistics by sub-areas using the current draft map, and then that'll give us a platform from which to discuss.
I had one back here,
Well,
here,
mine's
here, so
different.
it's kind of bouncing around.
This-
All right.
So I thought that you were getting data from the test wells primarily that you guys put in. Is that not true?
We're getting data from the wells that we measure on a quarterly basis now. We have test wells that were drilled for the project that we continue to get data from, that we have recorders sitting on them. But we also get additional data. We get, as you were pointing out, there's certain permits that are required to get measurements in March and submit that data to the department. So we have that additional data.
And you're using that.
And we're
data.
using that also. So there's about 300 wells where we get, that additional data.
Okay. And then, let's see, where were we? Kristen, and we do have some comments that came in online in the chat, however, it's from the public and might be appropriate that we could share those during the public comment period of time. They're general comments.
Well, and this might come into, as we're talking about trying to explain more about the data. My question is kind of around, how do you normalize the information or the data that comes from multiple points at multiple well depths? And then different pumping rates, some wells are obviously being pumped more actively than others. Is there any way to kind of normalize that to give it, and I'm trying not to use the word average, but, a normalization when you do have different depths. We're looking at 150 and below, or are we looking at 150 above? Are we breaking that out anyway?
Yeah.
Kind of trying to wrap my head around, knowing different spots in this area, knowing different wells, how do we, within a sub area, kind of try to find a normalization as we try to reach voluntary agreements or regulation or whatever it may be?
That's a great question, but so in one area, people are pumping deep. In other areas, they get better production out of the shallow. And so it varies from area to area within the basin. And so, yeah, it's a great question. So right now we're just kind of lumping them all together and looking at that data. But getting back to Weaver Springs, you're seeing your greatest rate of decline and the biggest total decline in the heart of the development. But as you get out to the periphery of that sub area, there's less development out there, but also you've gotten away from the volcanic deposits that Dark talked about, and you're starting to transition into that finer grained material. So the pumping effects are hitting this kind of resistor. And so in the heart of that development, you're seeing decline rates over 5 feet per year, to 10 feet per year. And you get it out to periphery and it's down to a foot a year. So yeah, this all comes into play. You're right. This is where we need to talk to the people that are more savvy with statistics than I am. I refer to them as statistics, but the statistics is something that we need to be mindful of.
Well, I'm finding one number that is going to represent a whole sub area is just from, that's like the average, the median, whatever number you want to choose is not going to be representative of every well in that sub area. Every individual well is going to have its own data set and its own calculated rate of decline, its own calculated magnitude of decline. And so you're absolutely right. There's variability across the basin within sub areas. And you've got to come up with, median is probably a better statistic than average in a lot of cases, but it's tricky to communicate. And looking at the maps with the color coded symbols can be helpful at times. There's a few ways to look at it.
One way to represent it is, they have this method of what's called the box whisker plot, and it shows you the median, the 25 percentile, the 75 percentile, and then, the outliers. And that can give you a sense as to what the range of values could be and what the outliers look like. So we can kick around different ways of presenting that data to kind of give the full range of what's going on within a sub area.
We have two in the back here, so I don't know if this is Fred or if your comments related to this discussion, go right ahead. Yep, it's you.
Yeah, Ben.
Well, all I gotta say is my well was fine until they had that huge explosion of pivots out there in that area and created this huge cone of depression. That's when my well started dropping. So however they curtail or figure out how to slow the pumping down to where that stops dropping, that's what I'm here for. That's just the way it is. There's only so much water, and if you're pulling too much out of an area, you are going to have wells being destroyed.
Okay, we take it right here, Fred.
And mine's not related to this exactly. Back to the 40-80 point. When you get into these areas of extreme dense sticky clay, as I call it, in the middle of the basin, the practicality of it, there's negligible flow through those areas. So when you talk about the flow direction from Harney Lake, it's really that's not really important or related to, and it's not related to the endophyte or the vegetation on these lakes. These internal inside basin lakes are surface water dependent vegetation ecosystems. They're not, there's some groundwater influences in a few little areas, but for the most part, your inflows, your big inflows maybe last for 10 years. So you could say the subsurface water lasts for 10 years, and you could call that groundwater, I guess, but it's a precipitation surface water flow system that dominates the vegetation pattern in these areas. So from a practicality, when we're looking at groundwater, you hit a 200, 500 foot sticky clay formation. You're crazy to drill into that because there's no water to speak of there that's retrievable in a useful manner. You might get a gallon or two for your house, and you have 30 gallons a minute. You might get a really good well driller to actually get that. So, I mean, we've drilled into some of that, and all it is money out and no functional retrieval or benefit to the aquifer above or the aquifer below. Anyway, so I don't think the 40-80 is that important at all. And I think that those massive clay layers out there, the lake sediment layers, dictate the separations in the basin to a lot of degree in some areas. So I look at the practical, and you guys have taught me some of this, where you look at the flow rate and those sorts of things. That dictates the tone of depressions in the outlying areas more than it does when you get close to Malheur Lake or Honey Lake or whatever. That's an important thing to, I understand the points were made by Zach and you guys when you say that. And I think it's important to say it and understand that the flow, even though it's microscopic, doesn't change direction. All right? But from a practical standpoint, when you look at the quantity of water and the relationships between areas with problems, it's kind of becomes insignificant fairly quick.
Okay, thank you. Let's kind of reorient you and take a look at these questions again, because providing feedback on these specific questions is certainly what's going to help define what this criteria that's agreeable and makes sense to everybody. So any thoughts? Or additional criteria, maybe it's something that hasn't been mentioned. Go ahead.
So, yes, my question is, using these criterias, how many of these sub areas would fall under the consideration for continued curtailment?
Well, I guess, we're proposing these criteria for ranking the sub areas as to which ones have the highest decline rate versus the ones that have the least decline rate. And then, the areas, sub areas that have the greatest amount of total decline versus sub areas that have the least total decline. And, so we can kind of look at these, put together a table for each of these criteria and rank them by criteria, and then figure out, okay, how do we prioritize these 4 different criteria, to further rank them.
So using that, so basically what you're saying, it's pretty obvious that Beaver Springs is falling, but Upper Silver Creek is
Well, yeah,
not going to fall into that criteria.
So, sorry, I just want to say, we probably, I could take us in a direction where we could really get into the minutia, but I think, identifying if the criteria is fair and appropriate for application with the sub areas, which we're also looking for feedback on. That's sort of the next, the next step. Once we've reached those, once we've crossed those thresholds, then we start to identify what is it.
So let me rephrase that. How many of the sub areas fall into one of those criteria that you have listed there?
Well, each of the sub areas have, generally with maybe the upper Blitz and correct me, Dark, are we seeing declines in the upper Blitz?
No.
Okay, so the majority of the sub areas have some level of decline. But there's a subset that have a much greater decline than others.
So let's use Upper Silver Creek for an example. Does it fit any of those criteria?
So Upper Silver Creek, we probably have about maybe 10 feet of total decline. And then, we have a decline rate of about a foot or less a year. And so, you compare that to, if you compare that to Crane, about the same a decline rate of about a foot a year, but a total decline up to almost 70 feet. Now we got a longer period of record. That gets back to what Fred's comment was. I don't know what the longest record we have for Upper Silver Creek right now. Yeah, so we may have a shorter period for Upper Silver Creek, but with that, but the development up in that area is more recent than it was, out here in Harmony Valley. So, so what we're proposing is, once we get, the feedback on these criteria, then we'll go to each of these sub areas and put together a table for each of these criteria and how these various things rank per criteria. And then, we can kind of kick this around, some more.
So if I could maybe rephrase a little bit, and maybe this will come out as like a well done, Tim. Yeah, yes. But obviously what we're talking about is we want to look at total magnitude of decline and say areas with the most decline should be ranked a higher priority for curtailment than areas with the least amount of decline. And we want to look at rate, and we want to say areas with the highest rate of decline should be ranked higher than areas with the lowest rate of decline. And we proposed this 40-80, and we've heard a lot of feedback on the 40-80 feet and whether or not that's valid or should be considered. And that's really helpful. And then a well-defined cone of depression. So Mark asked the question, well, what is that? How do you define that? What does that look like? And that's a really good question. And I think we can come back with more information on that. So the question is, does that make sense? Does it make sense to prioritize the areas with the largest declines and the highest rates of declines well above the areas that aren't?
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. And that's really helpful. Thank you. And then the question will be, what do we set the thresholds at? Is it, we're going to curtail places with 3 or more feet per year of decline over some period of record? Are we going to curtail areas with 50 or more feet of total decline over, the period of record we have? And that's where we have to get into that data and statistics conversation so that we all can understand and agree that yes, this data is representative of the sub area, and this is what we should use in order to make these decisions. And
I think Lisa has a question.
Yeah, we're gonna go there in a second.
And I think that's conversation we're gonna have next time, because we're gonna have to prepare numbers and we're gonna have to be ready to have a robust conversation around that data.
Hold on, we got one online. Lisa, go right ahead.
Thanks. And now after that explanation, maybe this isn't a great point to make, but I was a little confused as to whether those criteria that you ran through with the Weaver Springs area were thresholds or not. And I was going to comment that I think that 3 foot a year is too high for a annual decline rate. Maybe it's better to think of it as when we do this initial evaluation, just like but I think if this goes to Ken's comment, maybe in the chat as well, as maybe just show a range of where all these different sub areas fall out. Because yeah, I think 3 feet a year, you're looking at 30 feet a decade of decline, and that seems definitely not reasonably stable and definitely, far in excess of where we should be trying to take actions to address. So that's my comment.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. I want to emphasize, I tried to emphasize this at the beginning of the presentation. So what we're presenting, that was not a threshold. That was just like, these criteria for how we're going to rank the sub areas. And I was just, for the example, I was just saying, for the highest priority, if you had sub areas that exceeded 3 feet per year of decline, but that's not a threshold that anything less than 3 feet per year of decline is acceptable. It's just saying, it's like, if we're not able to deal with all the sub areas all at once, how are we going to prioritize the order that we're going to go through, address these sub areas for potential curtailment?
Yeah, so that's helpful. So I think, yeah, maybe just laying them out, on these different criteria and seeing where they fall, and then seeing what's realistic and what's possible in terms of kind of getting at this problem.
Great, thank you, Lisa. I see your hands in the back. We got some online here, and so we're going to go to the comments provided in the chat. Tim, if you can relay those.
So Zach made one comment about folks. He recommends folks should refer to the USGS studies, especially with respect to base flow and phreatophyte area, and cites another reference, Albano et al. Sorry, 2021, to learn more about the evidence related to ecosystem use of groundwater. And there are also good discussions about this during the Harney Community-Based Water Planning Collaborative. Come join that collaborative to learn more. Thanks for the pitch there, Zach. I appreciate it. And then I think Ken and Chris Hall both had some comments, but Christopher and, Ken, can we hold off on those until public comment? And, would appreciate hearing them then, so.
Okay, so before we go into that, I just want to double check, because there's a lot of people in the RAC we haven't heard from. I want to see if there's any questions from folks that haven't had an opportunity to pose their comments or questions. Yes.
Yeah, I want to get back to Mark's question about, the cone of depression. So what, up to this point, what we've been working with is a well-defined cone of depression. It would be if the cone of depression was anything that went from 40, 80 or less in elevation and contours. So if you had a closed ring within that sub area of a 40, 80 or 40, 90, and you had subsequent rings that took the elevation below those elevations, that's what we're defining as a pretty well defined cone of depression.
So the 40-80 and the cone of depression are basically the same.
Well, that's the starting point.
That's the starting point.
That's starting.
But I mean, you also have one that was below 40-80, it might be a trigger. So you're rate of cone of depression, if it's below 40-80, it might be a trigger, so it'll establish cone of depression. So in my mind, they're the same. And that's fine, Gary. I do think we need to rate them. I wasn't arguing that the 4 points be rated. I was trying to have conversation on just some of the specific points in the area.
Yeah, and I'm sorry if I came across argument.
No,
I wasn't
I was
taking
trying.
track.
I mean,
Yeah, like,
yeah. We'll talk offline, Gary. So good. If 40-80 is a moderating groundwater elevation below 40-80 is one of the criteria, right here or not. But then if an established cone of depression also has the 40-80 level, they're almost the same in my.
Well, except if you had a flat graded area where there isn't a cone of depression, it's possible to go below 48.
and not end up with a ring, but. Yeah.
Fred.
Yeah, mine's relevant to this. First, in terms of the number of years of data and quality of data, a lot of the historical data is real important and useful to you guys and to us, but we know that the total number of data points of the older data and the collection protocols don't always pass the muster. It's still good information. It's a little bit more subjective than objective, and I'm thinking that would be one criteria, and the other would be the more recent data from more data sets where you have 3 years, 5 years of data with longer term desire to have 12 years of data. And I really think that type of specific criteria kind of needs to be built into the system, because our longer term goal, has to be better and better information to make these decisions by. You're gonna make some short-term decisions that are based on what we know or what we think we know. When you collect more data points, your clarity becomes a lot better. And your decision making becomes a lot better. So I just encourage maybe that we need to look at, and I think it may be different from one sub-area to another, that we look at, okay, we have a lot of data between 2012 and 2018 as an example, but beyond that, in an area, there's the data is hit or miss. So I think we have two types of data, at least, that would be used differently from area to area in the department. I think does that automatically, but we need to constantly have us or the public also analyze that, because sometimes our institutional knowledge is real old and bad memories. So you need to have objective data in there, and that's a good way to get everybody on a positive scale on this stuff. Positive. I mean, I look at incentives to be involved and incentives to do something different, incentives to, it's like a well that drops 100 feet. Sometimes that's because the well's improperly constructed and it's got a whole bunch of issues, and that's a bad data point. And you need a really good well driller to fix that. And so it gets skewed. So that's my point is the shorter duration of data that would be used more formally, but you don't ignore the other data.
Yes. Did you have another question? Yeah. You, yep.
Yeah, I do. Well, these subsections here, some of these are actually recharge areas for some of the other areas. Isn't that right?
I'd agree with that.
Because the upper Blitzen is obviously a recharge area for the lower Blitzen. And the upper Silver Creek is recharge area for the Hardy Lake and Weaver Springs. And it could even, and the Silvies would be the recharge for, like the, for both Weaver Springs and the Dog Mountain. And then you've got Rice Point sitting here, which runs out over. So your Poison Creek, Rattlesnake Creek and all this stuff would be the recharge area for pretty much everything over here. So are you forgetting that?
No, I'm not getting that.
You're not bringing it up.
Well, because, there's two types of recharge. You have your upper watershed recharge. You have some great recharge points in some of the flood irrigated areas, some not so much because of the heavy clay soils, etc. So I'm not forgetting that at all. Then you have artificial recharge opportunities that we haven't even talked about, where you access some of these rock formations on a wet year. You can actually utilize by breaking up that rock in some cases. Maybe they're there already and they just need water input. So I'm not forgetting that. I think you bring up a great point that we need to look at that. That's the positive side of the ledger. So I'm not sure what I said that would be in conflict with that.
Okay, thank you. We got about 15 minutes left on this item, so I wanted to come back to Jerry, anyone else with the department to ensure that the questions you need answered are getting answered, or at least the areas where maybe you feel like you haven't gotten feedback on that would be beneficial.
We only got to question 1 and 2. We haven't got to checkpoint 3 and 4.
So let's move there.
Okay.
But what should be the curtailment goal per sub area? Goals per sub area related to?
Yeah, in terms of decline rate, total decline, you know. At one point, people, ask, what does reasonably stable mean? Is the goal 0 decline or is it a decline rate? But I've heard, different sides of that discussion.
So Jerry, I think here's where we need a little context, because not everybody was on the groundwater study advisory committee. I'm not sure there's a common knowledge of how much recharge some of these subbasins get. My understanding is some of these subbasins get basically no modern recharge. So if you're, I think we have to have a fair understanding of that, because that might dictate what some of the goals are. I even said in the last several meetings, we're not going to go back to where we were. That's probably not possible within many lifetimes. So I think we make sure everybody's on the same page that stuck on Weaver Springs. It might not get no recharge. Bad English, hope there's not an English speaker here. So that also might dictate what your goal is in the next 10, 15, 30 years. The last thing I'll say, as I said it before, and I'll continue to say it, is if you look back in the 80s and 90s, when we did extractive timber, we were one of the average highest household incomes. Groundwater replaced that for a lot of the community and the county, as far as tax base, keeping our schools open, keeping our roads paved. If we look at a curtailment rate in some of these areas that are quick, that's going to have a big impact, more than just the farmers that live in that community. It's going to have an impact on this whole community. The department knew of declining water levels since the 90s. If you look at the hydrographs, a lot of those hydrographs showed more than a foot of decline since then. We decided not to do something as a department until 2015, 30 years. I still believe we need a generational glide path in a lot of these areas, where the community has the opportunity to look at what can replace this income, how we can keep ag to the fullest extent while trying to hit one of these goals.
So I'm gonna capture, I mean, I'm not gonna, get all that, but I'm gonna capture
I can read
economics.
or verbatim next time.
Yeah, and I think I know what you're requesting, and these could be ideal agenda items here in subsequent meetings as we move forward. So I think we know where we're going with that.
So are you saying, Mark, and this is hypothetical, that if there's an area that receives no recharge, that we should tolerate a higher rate of decline in that area than an area that does receive recharge?
I'm not positive I'm saying that,
Okay,
but I mean, if you see no recharge changing or slowing down the rate of decline is gonna be tough for an area that is receiving some recharge.
sure.
So I mean, I don't know honestly where I'm at on a lot of that, Tim.
Okay.
It's gonna be a very interesting and convoluted conversation.
Yeah, but it's a point of consideration.
It is, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I believe we need to moderate groundwater levels decline. I do. I believe we need to start using less groundwater in a lot of these areas. I do. I mean, the arbitrary numbers is where I'm gonna have a hard time. The total principal withdrawal in Division 10 is where I'm gonna have a hard time, because total principal withdrawal, if you're trying to hit stable groundwater levels in an area that doesn't get recharge, what is that? That's no pumping. Back in the groundwater study advisory committee, when that first came out 5 years ago, I asked the question, is the goal to shut off all the water? The department said no. In some of these areas, if you're getting no recharge and you want to stabilize the water level, farmer math says you got to shut off all the water. So I think we have to have an understanding as a RAC and the community, when we start making these numbers, what the implications of that might be. That's what I'm going at. And maybe that's what we have to do. Some people will think, but surely not in 5, 10, 15, 20 years.
Thank you. Yeah, do you have a comment on feedback on what we're looking at here with the third bullet?
Well, my comments on the data, the time frame, and language that encourages the data to moderate decisions or change them. It's sort of like back to Silver Creek, just this is an example. Half of their watershed was in the wildfire burn area, and you get tremendous recharge there when you get precipitation. I mean, it's a sponge. You guys heard me say that before. You can't even dig a catchment and collect water on most years because it's a sponge. You go to the west half out of that burn area and it's all juniper. So what would, if society actually made reasonable watershed decisions, that we manage that juniper community to its historical level where you had that recharge coming in there in a substantial manner, we might actually have an increase in water table in Silver Creek. My point is, don't really know, and in the different sub areas of the basin, you have more recharge opportunity than other areas. We don't really know what some of those are. I've brought up a number of them. And so those curtailment goals have to consider the length of time of data, the confidence level thereof, but also the positive side of that ledger. Because I don't think we fully understand. I know when you guys measured the water testing at my house, it was mixed water. Half of it was older, whatever number it really was. Half of it was real current. So it really gets into a mixed bag when you think that you're dealing with just really old water with no recharge. It's not really a clear picture even on that mark. So I just think the good quality data, lots of data. Has to be built into any. And I agree with the duration of decline has to be fairly long to reflect that level of data that we have and the quality of that data.
Thank you. I think we've got that captured. Anybody we haven't heard from, have any thoughts or questions or just feedback, you know, to the questions Jerry's proposed here? You know, specifically, what should the curtailment goals for the sub area relate to? You know, the groundwater level decline, ground decline rate, total decline, moderating groundwater elevations below 4,080 feet, moderating cone of depression, all the above. I suppose that, you know, that using good data speaks to all of the above. Yes.
Karen Moon with the Watershed Council. I think that for a little bit of this meeting today, we're getting bogged down in a data discussion that maybe should be left for another meeting rather than right at this point. Although it's good to bring it up and talk about it. I think with the criteria and the goals for the curtailment goals is a great place to start. You know, Jerry has said in his comments that use this criteria and then rank each sub area. You know, it's a great place to start. And let's not get bogged down in details that may work themselves out by the next meeting in allowing this process to continue. And I'll argue with Fred just a little bit. We had many discussions about data throughout the whole groundwater study. And at some point, everything that Fred said is right on, you know, right on. But at some point, you can't keep waiting for more data 12 years down the road. We need to start now so that we aren't creating a much bigger problem by waiting for more data. We need to make some decisions. And I had one question about, Dark made the comment about the contour lines being 2018. I'm trying to remember, was it the last meeting or the meeting before that we talked about with a critical groundwater designation, that there is a requirement for review every so many years.
Yeah.
So there's opportunities to update that. And let's not forget that, and let's keep moving forward and try to stop the bleeding.
Yeah,
that could be built into the rule too, right?
Yeah,
It's required to be built
So
into
every 3 years.
I mean, there's different ways to capture a review of specific things, basin by basin.
So I think what's being shared here, the thought is, you know, looking at the sub areas, looking at this criteria, saying, yeah, we're on the right path, on the right course, is going to reveal then and answer some of the questions that we all have. Some of the answers to all the questions we all have once we keep step forward, but we're not, you know, by taking the next step forward, we're not saying that that discussion is over or that those are 100% absolute final decisions, but it's going to allow us to give answers to the questions, maybe the questions we all really have. Yes, Mark.
One last thing is when we think through this for next meeting, the other thing, I mean, if you have a rate of decline that's a foot and you want to slow that rate of decline down by half, that really means you're going to shut half the water off of that area. So you're trying to achieve maybe a 6-inch rate of decline there. If you're going to try to achieve a 6-inch rate of decline in Weaver Springs, you're getting 95% of it off. So you gotta, when we start thinking numbers and levels of decline, what actually that means above the ground. That's when it starts to get real for this community. It's easy to say we want to slow the rate of decline. Let's take 6 inches off that rate of decline. But if 6 inches is 50%, that's 50% of all those pivots being shut down.
Yeah. So I mean, ultimately, yeah, we can connect the dots and you'll see what we're really talking about. And how that impacts people. And then we, you know, then we have that economics conversation as well, and what the community impact is.
Some of these levels fluctuate too, especially that's why I go over a period of time. We had 2 years in the last while, our static water table in March increased.
Yeah.
You look at the monitoring well above Anderson Valley. It's been there one of the longest. It's been there in the 70s. Gary kind of referred to it earlier. It was dropping a foot and a half. Some of the water rights, 4 or 5 pivots got transferred off from way there. 2 or 3 of those pivots have dried up. If you look at that measuring level now, it's only dropping about 6 inches. That might not be 6, 8 inches. That might not be what that whole area is. But drying up specifically around where you're going to be monitored can make a big difference in a hurry and not have the impact that you actually think it has.
So unless there's any objections, I think we're at least on our agenda, we're at the concluding point of this item. As with the last one, you know, provide us your feedback and comments and questions so that we can integrate those, but, you know, giving the green light to continue this process. We'll hopefully get to some of the more on the ground impact answers that we're all looking for. Okay.
Zach's had his hand up for quite a while.
Sorry about that. We missed it. Go ahead, Zach.
Yeah, no worries. I was also trying to be quiet because you specifically asked for people who hadn't talked already. I feel like I'm definitely not in that camp. So thanks for the opportunity to talk anyway. I do want to just put in a pitch from a process standpoint that I think there's some confusion in this conversation because we're almost conflating talking about curtailment and curtailment goals with this separate idea of talking about sub-area criteria and prioritization, or at least it feels like a conflation to me. And I think we might benefit from a process standpoint in future meetings to really talking about how do we delineate the sub-areas, and then separately talking about what does that mean for each sub-area? What are the goals we want to see? How do we want to address those through management actions, including curtailment? So I would just put that forth. The other thing I wanted to say is that is now that I've said that, I will also talk about my response to that third question of the curtailment goals. I do think it should change by sub-area. But I just wanted to support Karen's good points that we have a lot of information. We've had these USGS and Water Resources Department studies. We have dozens and dozens of wells with long-term data sets across the basin. We should, yes, continue to collect information. We should, yes, continue to expand data collection and revisit this rulemaking in the future based upon future data. But we have enough information to take action. And I hope that the action that we take results in long-term sustainability for the economy and for the ecosystem and for domestic well users in the basin. So that's my overarching goal for each of these sub areas, is to think about what does sustainability mean on a long-term basis for each of those sub areas. But I think the answer is going to be different for each one. So I'll look forward to having that conversation.
Great, thank you. And we've captured that, and we'll consider that for our future process conversation. All right, so let's move on to the next agenda item, and recognizing there are some comments that were provided in the chat. We're going to hold on to some of those because we do have the public comment period. So I'll ask those people that are providing comments in the chat. You have the opportunity to share those yourself in the public comment period, or we'll have those captured in part of a summary. Ultimately, that'll also go in that comment period section. So just so you know, you have that choice. So let's go ahead and move forward. Yeah. We're going to talk about the rule language discussion. It's about 25 minutes for this.
I can make that happen. All right, so we're going to talk about classification, which we've talked about a couple of times before. Remember, classification is the tool by which we can specify the types and uses of water. And the goal of classifying is really to prevent new groundwater permits from being issued in upland and recharge areas and within the critical groundwater area. But within the critical groundwater area, we can specifically deny any applications. So we have that extra power within the critical groundwater area. So the goal here, as I said, is to prevent those new permits in those upland and recharge areas. And we want to do that as best as possible without preventing certain types of projects from being able to access water. So the first one is PREP, the program to try to reduce water use through those payments. We've talked about community water systems, we've talked about construction projects, we've talked about artificial recharge and ASR, and we've talked about municipal uses. So those are the types of projects that we want to be able to get water for, while preventing new permits from being issued. So I want to go through a couple of examples of language that has been used in rule before, and we can just see them as examples, and then we'll talk about a couple of options for how we go about doing this, and then we'll talk through the pros and cons of those options. So the Give Yak example. So this is one that you're likely all familiar with, but when the Greater Harney Valley Groundwater Area of Concern was established in rule back in 2016, there were essentially some exceptions put in rule to allow for some new permits to occur. So essentially, for a new permit to be issued, it had to not be found to have a potential for substantial interference. It had to have a total rate and duty that was being offset by a voluntary cancellation of valid right. And the application had to have been pending as of April 15th, 2016. So if all those things were met, there was a clause in the rules that then allowed that to be a classified use, and so permitting was allowed. So there were a few permits issued after the rules were adopted in 2016, and groundwater was classified for exempt uses only in the Give Yak. So that's one example. Another example is the Deschutes Basin. So in the Deschutes rules, there's what's called the mitigation program. And the mitigation program allows a new permit application to bypass the potential for substantial interference test. So essentially, if a new use is going to impact surface water less than or equivalent to a right that is being voluntarily canceled, then the permit application can be approved without any additional mitigation. So essentially it says, in simple terms, if this right has no more harm to surface water than the current right being canceled, then we can issue a new permit without looking at the potential for substantial interference test. And so that's a really straightforward way of getting around a specific test in the groundwater application process. And then my last example here is from the Stage Gulch Critical Groundwater Area, which is up in the Umatilla Basin. And Stage Gulch was established sometime back in the late 80s, early 90s. And this one specifically calls out that groundwater allocation, and so it was different terms under the old rules. And basically there was a sustainable annual yield. So think of that as the same as permissible total withdrawal. And that sustainable annual yield is then allocated or distributed amongst the groundwater right holders within the critical groundwater area, starting with the oldest priority coming to the most junior, right? But the rules specifically call out that municipal use is going to be prioritized first, regardless of priority date. So even if a municipality had an older or a younger priority date than the last allocation, they're going to get water first. And then after the municipalities have been allocated water out of that total amount of water being allocated, then the most senior water rights holders to the most junior are allocated water until the total quantity of water runs out. And that's how a prioritization scheme was done within a different critical groundwater area within the state. So that's another potential option. So when we're talking about trying to achieve our goal here of being able to hopefully allow for water for certain types of uses, while also limiting the issuance of any new permits, we've got a couple of options that we've talked about internally, and I want to run past you all here. So the first one is we could classify for exempt uses only. And remember, exempt uses are specifically called out in statute as domestic use, stock watering, up to a half acre of lawn, etc. All those things in ORS 537, 545. So it'd be for exempt uses only, and then we could require for new applications, some sort of offset program. So similar to the Deschutes example, right? So if you're canceling a valid groundwater right and it meets a certain set of criteria, then we would consider that essentially that groundwater right that you're canceling as offsetting the impacts of a new groundwater right, and we could issue a new right. So we could build a program like that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. The other option is to classify for exempt uses only, and then to rely on transfers to get water for projects. So the transfer rules are fairly, well, the transfer rules are set currently, and we're not able to manipulate those with our basin program rules. So the transfer rules are what they are, but we can talk about how transfers could meet our goals as well. So in option one, we classify for exempt uses only and we build an offset program. Some offset requirements we've thought about internally are the offset would be provided by canceling a valid right that is subject to transfer and not subject to regulation under the critical groundwater area. So essentially, you have to have a right that's actively being used. It's actual wet water, it's not subject to forfeiture, etc., and it's not being regulated off. So we don't want to issue a new application for from using a right that is not going to be allowed to pump anyway. That wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. And then another potential requirement would be that the total rate, duty, and acres for the new right can't exceed the total rate, duty, and acres for the offset right. So it has to be at least a 1-for-1 transfer, right? So if you are, or a 1-for-1 offset, you can't take a 3-acre duty right and apply for a 4-acre duty right. You could take a 3-acre duty right, cancel it, and apply for a 2-acre duty right. That would make sense. But you don't want it, we don't want to enlarge a right through that. So one of the challenges with this system is that a new right would have a new priority date. And we would also have to write into rule some way of providing preference for that new right. And in the statutes and in the rules for a critical groundwater area, the only thing we can prioritize is domestic use or residential use, I believe is the term in statute, and stock watering. So if we were to allow this offset program to occur and we were to build it such that you could cancel a right and get a new right, you would be getting the most junior right. And in the case of curtailment in that area, you would be the first person to be regulated in that area if regulation occurs, because you would be the most junior water right holder. And so that potentially isn't a good option for getting water for the types of uses we're thinking about, like construction projects, municipal use, etc. Because municipal use is different than residential use. So residential use would be essentially domestic, whereas municipal use would include businesses and commercial, industrial, etc. So we would have to put some framework around that. So that's option one. Option two is to classify for exempt uses only and rely on transfers. So in this case, no new permit applications would be approved. And then transfers in the Harney Basin, and remember the classification area we have talked about being the study area boundary within the Malheur Lake Administrative Basin. So there's a portion of Grant County included there. And then within the Malheur Lake Basin, we've said within Harney County. So there's a couple of boundaries there, but you basically get to a slice of the Harney study area that basically excludes a couple little edges where it goes over boundaries. So no new permit applications would be approved within that larger classification area. And then transfers in the Harney Basin would be evaluated for same source and injury, which are the two common evaluations we do in any transfer. So within the critical groundwater area, we would likely tie that to a sub area. So we would consider same source within a sub area. So we would prevent sub area to sub area transfers. It wouldn't make sense to allow people to transfer a right out of a curtailment area into a non-curtailment area, or maybe take a senior right out of a non-curtailment area and put it into a curtailment area. So that's how we would look at that same source designation. And then we'd also look at injury. So is this right is transferring this right at this location going to injure other users in that area? And so we discussed it internally and talking with our transfer section. One of the challenges we had talked about initially was changing the season of use of a right. So for instance, we've talked a lot about the Crane community and wanting to potentially put in a community well and a community water system. Well, they would need a groundwater right to supply that water. And a transfer, in this case, we believe we can change the season of use and take potentially an irrigation right with the season of use for an irrigation season, call it March 1 to October 31. And we could expand that so that the season of use could be year round. But we would not allow the duty to expand, and the rate would be reduced so that it matches with that duty over that expanded period of time, right? So if you have a 1 CFS right, and you're going from 9 months out of the year to 12 months out of the year, maybe the rate changes to 0.75 CFS, while the duty, 3 acre-feet per acre over however many acres it was, would be left the same. So that could provide water in those cases. The same thing could happen for construction projects. You use transfers or temporary transfers. But this would allow water to be flexibly used for certain projects while not creating a complicated process by which to do that. So a couple of considerations, things I've been thinking about and we've talked about internally, is that both options require a valid groundwater right. So nowhere here are we talking about allowing new groundwater rights without canceling some old groundwater right or using some other groundwater right. An offset program is likely going to require a complicated set of rules. And when you design something complicated, oftentimes there are unintended consequences. And I think I personally prefer a simple, straightforward plan for trying to achieve our goal of being flexible and getting water for these projects while also protecting and preventing new permits. And then the last one I already talked about a little bit, the ORS 537-742 2B states that we can only accord preference for residential and stock water uses, and all other uses must follow prior appropriation. So if we issued new rights and you were to say issue a right for you were to cancel an irrigation right and issue a municipal or a industrial right, that would have a junior priority date, and there's nothing we can write in rule to allow that priority in the system. And so if curtailment were going to happen in that sub area, they would be the first right to curtail. And so that's a real challenge there. So I just threw a whole bunch of information at you, and I'm going to put up the rules that we've talked about previously. So one is currently in rule, and we're not recommending to modify it. We've already talked about 2, and 3 is the last one. And this is a specific call out for CREP to allow for limited licenses. And the reason we would allow limited licenses for CREP is because in the end, a couple of years of use on a limited license results in a permanent cancellation of the right that was used in the CREP program. And so that will be a net positive to the system and is beneficial overall for reduction of use. And so that's why it gets a specific call out there. So based on that, what do people think about the differences between the 2 options?
Yeah, so as Tim mentioned, there's a lot there, and we don't have a ton of time, so we don't want to unfairly have you create a response or provide your feedback in that. So, unlike the first 2 agenda items where we need to keep them all alone, we have a little bit more grace here to continue this conversation in the next meeting. So don't feel obligated to, here is what I think. You can take it home and think on it a bit. John online has his hand up. John, go ahead.
Thank you. I guess a quick question, just to verify, did you say the CREP program does end up in the water rights being canceled during that process? Or
Yeah, I'm not the expert on that. I'll turn it over to Graham and let Graham talk about it really quick.
Yes, so if you enroll in the Harney Valley Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, you will voluntarily cancel your groundwater rights.
Okay. Thank you. The everything I'd say is that having, I do a lot in the Deschutes Basin, and Harney, obviously. The just from experience, the offset approach has not worked very well compared to transfers. So I guess I'd encourage transfers. But the thing that I really wanted to say is where we've run into trouble, or one area we've run into trouble in the Harney Basin, is when we have like road construction or solar farm construction, and we just need 1 year, maybe 2 years, whatever, but a short-term water source for like dust control, that kind of thing, construction. And currently there's not an avenue for that. I'm not sure that either of these has addressed that, because the idea is not to, cancel another water right. But I guess I'd be encouraging some sort of, voluntary, fallowing of one water right as offset for a limited license or a temporary transfer for those things. And a temporary transfer doesn't allow you to change the type of use. So you can't just do a temporary transfer of an existing water right, for solar. That doesn't work. So that's where you need like some way to offset with a limited license. Hope that made sense.
Yeah, I think we got that. That makes, the opportunity for short-term usage. Yes, Mark.
Just to continue speaking too much today. For her option 2, I do think we could look at why would it have to be the most junior water right. I'm not sure if that's something that we could write in rules. If somebody's trying to say grow nursery crop under a greenhouse and wants to extend it so it has to be transferred, why they would have to subject their water right. Lastly, there's a couple communities throughout the basin, Crane, Fields, French Glen, where there's residencies in unincorporated area. Why not just write it in the rule, take 25, 30 acre feet off the total permissible withdrawal, give to that community to be able to use for a future municipal system. Kind of like your school thing here, but if you're gonna have to take it off the total permissible withdrawal, just do it now. I mean, 30 acre feet is 10 acres. And if you're looking at 2,000 acres there.
Yeah, so the school thing, I want to point out, I made a mistake. That's actually in statute now. It went in about the same time the critical groundwater areas, Stage Gulch and Butter Creek, had that put in. So those exempt uses for schools are specifically in statute. It's allowed. But yeah, that's a good point. I appreciate that.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
So can I ask a follow-up question to make sure I
I
understand?
limit myself on how much I'm speaking today.
Sure. Now, yeah, I gotcha. I guess what I didn't understand was why it has to be a new right. So if we do an offset program and you're canceling a right and you have a new application in, a new application should get a new priority date at the time, from the time of the application, right?
There's an offset, I mean, on offset, I was preferring to transfer. So currently now, if you were transferring, you would have to take a more junior water right with your neighbors. You could go and solicit them and they would allow you to use your old priority date if need be. Why can't we just write it in rules? If I'm transferring a water right that I want to change to a different use, I maintain my priority.
If you're transferring, you maintain the priority date.
Okay. So that was
in an offset where you cancel the original right and get a new right. The new right comes with a new priority date, and the offset right that's canceled is no longer existing.
Another reason I don't like option 1.
Okay. Fair.
Okay. Yeah, some support for option 2. Again, we don't feel obligated to vote or anything like that. That's not what we're doing, but you know, it's good to get your feedback on what you like or dislike. And if there aren't any, you know, we can, again, this is something that, you know, this information will be available. You can always connect with myself or anyone else, you know, that you have contact with the department to share your input or their thoughts on this, and it'll be revisited as you know, as we move forward. Okay, well, if there's nothing else there, we'll move on to public comment. Is everybody comfortable there? Yes. Oh, yeah, and we're gonna send around the sign up sheet, so don't get up yet, stay there. So for public comment, I guess before we get started, I'd like to know how many people would like to provide public comment. So if you're a member of the public, you would like to provide a comment that you haven't yet, please raise your hand if you're in the room or if you're online. So 2, 3, okay. And then online, if you're a member of the public, if you'd like to provide comment, go ahead and raise your virtual hand. And we have the comments that have been submitted. We'll include those in the summary. So unless you, I suppose, if your comment has been provided in that manner, that'll get carried over. If you want to restate it, you certainly can. So raise your hand if you'd like to do that.
So that's why they stopped running the do it.
Okay, so let's see, we got. Okay, so we got 2 online, Ken and Chris. We got 3 in person. So we'll do in person first and then we'll go online. I ask if you provide a public comment, it's okay to come forward just so we're not shouting in the back. So I know we had 1 here, is that right? So we'll start here. Again, I guess just, you know, we're all respectful people, but you know, be respectful of each other, you know, no personal attacks, no foul language. This is just the opportunity to provide your input. It'll be received, you know, if it's a question that the department has the ability to answer, they may elect to do that now, but they may elect to just receive that input and respond later. Try to keep it, you know, 5 minutes tops. If 5 minutes, it turns out will be a long time. So I don't see that being too much of an issue. And yeah, again, just when it's your turn, please at least come closer to the horseshoe so that the microphones can pick it up. So we'll just go ahead, start here.
So I actually have 2, and it kind of has to do with implementation. So I was part of the groundwater collaborative meetings, spent a bunch of time discussing that, and always the sticking point is how in the heck are we going to get this implemented? And so one of the things that it brings to mind with this whole discussion of sub areas is what kind of organization to those sub areas are you guys even thinking of that? I mean, is it going to be like kind of water districts? Would that make sense that they sort of follow that model? And then the other piece of that is, so we talked a lot about curtailment, and in our collaborative discussions, we talked a lot about voluntary agreements. So when we're talking about priorities for how we're going to do curtailment, it kind of seems to me like maybe we should also be thinking about those areas that are the most ripe for voluntary agreements and put some special emphasis into trying to do some outreach to begin to have those discussions about having voluntary agreements, because like we talked about, one person saying, yeah, I'll do it, isn't going to cut it anywhere. So maybe having some sort of organization to this sub area concept, and then having some sort of mechanism that we're thinking about in terms of outreach for voluntary agreements. And we do recognize that Harney County would then be the guinea pig for voluntary agreements. So none of us are really super great thinking that's so wonderful, because it sounds like a long, convoluted process, which we've already been through, right? But just sort of that, talking curtailment, and then we've been talking voluntary agreements and how can we avoid curtailment? How can we try to smooth that process out? And it seems to me, again, that this sub-area concept lends itself to some type of organization.
Excellent. No, I think valid comments and I think really good input. I don't know if any response is warranted, but I think we're capturing those thoughts and look at how that gets folded into the process.
And then just for the record, can you say your name, please?
Leslie Richmond.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I should have mentioned that. There's definitely, before you provide comment, provide your name. That's really helpful. Okay, we're gonna go to the back over here.
Yeah, I'm just curious if everyone knows how much water is down there. I mean, if we have, one of the criteria is, 3 feet or more dropping each year. Well, what if there's so much water in there, it's dropping 50 feet every year? Or maybe because it's so little water, we can be looking about dropping half an inch in the problem. So is there a way to speculate how much water is down there? Are you assuming? Are you basing the problem that we're having is because we're losing so much water, not more recharging it? But shouldn't part of that be how much more is down there in the schedule? Or is there no way to figure that out?
Sure. And what was your name?
And Leslie?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, is the department, is anybody?
That's a really tough one. Yeah. I mean, so remember that it's not just about how much water is down there. It's what happens to groundwater dependent ecosystems and injury to senior surface water or senior water rights holders, right? So if you allow groundwater declines to go below the level at which groundwater dependent ecosystems are able to access that water, they become damaged. And as we allow, if we allow groundwater declines to continue, we begin to have domestic well owners, their homes, their wells go dry and they have to spend money to drill a deeper well. Same thing happens for agricultural wells. As the groundwater level declines, you have to drill deeper and deeper to get water, and your pumping costs also go up because now you're lifting the water even farther. So there are some very strong negatives for allowing groundwater declines, regardless of how much water or how far down the water goes. So it's not a function of like, we're going to run out of water eventually and we want to have water for our children. It is a function of those other things as well. And those are considerations.
But that's a good question. And I think as we get into, broader public outreach, that's the kind of questions people will have. So appreciate that. Chad.
So Chad Carges, this is just a process point. Zach brought it up earlier, but I think it helped the next meeting out a lot smoother. So prioritization of the sub areas, that's a different process than curtailment conversations. If we could do something to make sure those stay separated, I think it would go better.
Thank you.
Okay. And online, was there 2? Is that accurate?
Ken and then Chris.
I think we might have 3 now. Ken, Chris, and Brenda?
Brandon.
Oh, Brandon, sorry. Okay, Ken, you can go ahead and unmute and provide your comment.
Thank you. Just a quick comment. I really like the subdivision. Would like to see the map, like to see it made available. I think the Harney County website would be a wonderful place to make it available, because it could easily be overlaid then with water rights, points of diversion, places of use, and groundwater contours from the GS study. The conversation about prioritization, I think that there was a confusion between characteristics of the sub areas and then how you would prioritize, what kind of criteria you would use to prioritize, and then how you would apply those in some regulatory manner. So I think there's 3 steps there that got conflated, and I think you need to separate those very clearly so that you present the sub areas and what are their conditions, what their characteristics are. Then you talk about how you want to prioritize those, which ones have the greatest effect on domestic well users? Which ones have the greatest potential to affect groundwater dependent ecosystems? Which ones show the greatest level of decline? Those kinds of things. And then you talk about, okay, you know what their characteristics are, you know what some of the concerns are. Then you think about, okay, what do we want to do? Protect the most or the least damage? Do we want to protect the or make most effort on the most damage? So those are three separate steps in my mind. And I think there could be better conversation if those were segmented and dealt with sequentially rather than kind of thrown together, because it leads to the kind of conversation you had today that is inconclusive. I like the consideration for making sure that you're deliberating on what are the potential future unintended uses or unintended consequences of language. And I think you've done a good job in trying to wrestle through that. I like the cutout for crap, of course, but I think some of the other considerations, particularly community well systems, are something that could have significance for the future. But thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you very much. Chris.
Christopher, yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for this opportunity to be present for your conversation. I thought it was a great RAC meeting that you have and you held today, and I appreciate being able to offer some comments. The carving up of the critical groundwater area into numerous sub-areas, some of which do not appear sufficiently discrete, is elective, and it's a choice that's made. In this case, the segregation allows for the piecemeal application of these Division 512 rules, imposing corrective control orders. The piecemeal effect confounds the efficient and timely management of water in the critical groundwater area when future necessary changes must be made to further impose corrective control orders on other sub-areas. The carving up of the sub-areas serves as a loophole, potentially weakening the critical groundwater area process. As such, the scheme must be prevented from allowing unreasonable water use to further damage the aquifers. Every time the Water Resources Department or the Water Resource Commission needs to impose additional corrective control orders on sub-areas in the future, it could take 5 to 10 years to go through the rulemaking process, go through the contested case hearings process, and then wind through the appeals courts of Oregon to actually curtail water. This runs counter to the legislative intent of House Bill 2192, passed to streamline the critical groundwater area process. Let me underline that. It was to streamline the process. The carving up of the critical groundwater area into sub-areas is a perfect storm of obstruction without this following remedy. At the time the Water Resource Commission designates the critical groundwater area and the Oregon Water Resources Department notates the total permissive withdrawals for each sub-area, all the sub-areas should be included in the contested case hearing subject to corrective control provisions under ORS 537.742. Then, when various sub-areas dip below their total permissive withdrawals as defined by the criteria for curtailment, the Oregon Water Resources Department should implement curtailments in the sub-areas as necessary under the legal authority established by the contested case hearing. To be clear and to reiterate, since all of the sub-areas have their total permissive withdrawals set, all the corrective control orders for each sub-area can be issued in the contested case hearing up front, ready to be triggered at a later time when those total permissive withdrawals and criteria for curtailment for each sub-area have been exceeded and met respectively. Built into the contested case hearing would be the automatic imposition of corrective control orders carried out ministerially by the Water Resources Department staff upon the preset triggers. The most junior water rights would be regulated off first, followed by others according to seniority, until the total permissive withdrawals have been stabilized. There is no reason why this flexible system could not work in reverse as water levels stabilize in the aquifers. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, Brandon.
Yeah, thank you. So I appreciate the conversation that we've been having over, priority areas to focus on, to curtail, and kind of some of those targets that we might want to start thinking about in the sub areas. But I'm wondering if it's if we're driving in the dark a little bit with some of this, because we don't even know what any of these measures can do. If we were to cut, to stop using, half of the over allocated acre feet of water, overnight, how would the system even respond to that? I think we don't really know. We don't really have an idea of what the potential is out there. And I think one of the things that we might be able to use in this conversation is the conceptual model. And that was kind of the idea behind that, to be able to plug some of these numbers in, and see what that might do in the Harney Basin, in the system, so that we're not, making these, carte blanche decisions about where we should cut water, and assuming that we might be able to see a response in the system. So my suggestion would be, firstly, to kind of plug in the conceptual model, to help us, guide this process of prioritization of what needs to be focused on first, like the priority areas, and how much to consider cutting in terms of, how that will affect groundwater levels. And, we talked a little bit about, reasonably stable and what does that mean. But we kind of need to know, it's a very complicated system. So we kind of need to know, what our potential is in terms of stabilizing the decline, before we can really, start to determine priority areas and areas to focus on. So I guess that's just my comment. I think we need just more context and more actual numbers, before we can really have a good conversation about this. And then, lacking some of that, maybe we just take the adaptive management approach and set some soft targets, for things that we might want to cut in certain areas, and then, adapt those as we see fit, if we see the type of response that we're hoping to see. But I know it's a complicated system, and really, we can't assume that, just conserving a certain level of a certain amount of water will be able to see that show up in the groundwater reservoir instantaneously. There's a lot going on there, but that would be my suggestion, is that we kind of ease into it a little bit and see what the potential is, before we set some solid targets to cut. So thank you.
No, thank you. That was great, excellent feedback. I think that wraps us up. We don't have anybody else.
I don't see any other hands.
Okay. So we appreciate that, and really good feedback. And again, the feedback that was provided in the chat, we will include that as well as part of the public comment record. So looking at where we're headed here. One more slide. Yeah. Okay. So our next RAC meeting is November 29th.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Yeah. After Thanksgiving. back here, 1 to 5. Then you can see the dates there for the future RAC meetings in January and February. As we talked, these were some pretty intense conversations today, major topics. Certainly take the opportunity to think about this, what you've heard, provide additional feedback to us. I put my card on the table here in the meeting room. I put my contact information in the chat. So if anybody'd like to provide any additional feedback on the agenda items, certainly you can steer them to me and I'll help make sure they get to the right place. If you have any, definitely want to make sure that this process as a facilitator and being process focused, make sure that this is reflective of your needs and interests and you're participating in the way that you want to and the information is good and understood. So that kind of feedback is really beneficial for me. Make sure that we're doing this process in a way that's meeting your needs and interests. And, again, your individual perspective is hugely important on this. So I welcome the opportunity to have one-on-one conversations with any members of the RAC. So again, reach out to me with that contact information and we can set that up. And then, if there's issues or concerns that you have, again, that you're not comfortable bringing to the conversation, I can do that for you. So again, thank you very much and travel safe if you're going a long ways. See you in November.
Thank you all. Thanks, everybody online.